Morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Bit tired, but I'm here.
Yeah, I know.
All right, how are
Body
you?
woke me up at 4 a.m. So
4 a.m.
yeah,
Nice.
not happy about it, but whatever.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you. Monday morning. It is what it is. Not a bad turnout for Monday morning, though. I think we'll probably get a couple more stragglers. I think I kind of feel like I might need to reset my clocks a little bit here. What time y'all got?
9:06.
9:06.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm a little behind. Okay. Well, thank heavens for online Monday morning. Still got some folks trickling in here. How y'all doing? Are y'all okay?
Fine, okay.
I feel like I dropped some bombs last week with that exposure discussion and left some people traumatized. I don't want that. It's not what I would have for you. I'm going to go over that worksheet with you guys after I talk to you a little bit about depth of field today. See if I can help you make some sense of that. Let's see where I'm at. Get my modules set up. All right. What is this? Week 8? Week 9? Oh, 10. We're all the way up to crafting the image, depth of field. We're zooming through this stuff now, man. I think we are bumping up pretty close to the end of the semester here. Let me check my calendar. Looks like, yeah. I think this is, no, we got 2 more discussions next week. We're going to shoehorn them in. So we got this week and next week. Not bad. Then you guys will get a cushy, 3 weeks off? It's a good deal. All right, let me start getting this thing wound up. Let me share my screen with you all. And have a, say what? Sign into Zoom. I think I'm already in, dude. All right. Cancel that. Okay, how are we looking? You guys got this on your screen now, section 2.0? All right, so I want to talk to you about this stuff first, and then we can take the remainder of the time and go over that worksheet if you guys want to. This guy, the exposure worksheet, which you should all have handed in as of the start of class today. So if you haven't handed it in yet, go ahead and get it into me so it's not late. And then hopefully I can give you the answers by the end of this lecture today. All right, so just in general, how do you all feel about the discussion we had last week in terms of all of the different ways to control the camera and then this exposure conundrum? What do you think? I mean, does anybody have any thoughts after doing the worksheet and thinking about the lecture and doing the reading and stuff, which I'm assuming you're all doing like nice, good students?
After doing the worksheet specifically, I mean, I felt kind of, I don't know, annoyed at the numbers, if that makes any sense. Just because it's like, if you already understand the relationship of like the frame rate and all that and how it all works together,
Yeah.
then knowing the specific numbers of this goes up and that goes down and the specific numbers of everything don't really matter at that point. Because it's just like, grab the camera, oh, the exposure's here, okay, mess with this, mess with that. It's just better to do it in the field than to try and chart it out in your brain and be like, well, if this goes up here, then I need this here. It's like, just point the camera and fix it if it's not working. Just kind of mess with it.
Well, yeah, I guess that's the beauty of the digital age, right? We have these cameras now that are confirming our estimations just, by checking a little LCD screen. So that makes it very handy. It certainly does. However, I would just caution you to say, don't trust monitors. Why? Well, first of all, you know, if we're making some content, I guess it's all okay if your end user is watching your content on a, on a 5-inch screen, right? I mean, and that's pretty, pretty small. And you got roughly, if you're lucky, you have a 5-inch screen. This has got a 5-inch screen on it. The Pocket Cinema Camera 4K has a 5-inch screen. It's a little bit smaller screen on the original, what we're calling the OG Pocket Camera now, which is like, I guess this is about 4 inches in diagonal. The GH5 is even worse. I mean, that little screen that swings out, it's nice that it articulates, but my gosh, I mean, how much confirmation can you really get out of that? When you're out, day exterior in the sunlight and the screen's kind of blacking out on you because the sun is so bright and you can't really tell, even on the little FC1000. I mean, that's even smaller than the GH5. This is not going to be your best gauge of anything. This is really, I think, more than anything else, gives you a small room for confirmation if you're looking at your framing and stuff, and the overall brightness of your image, making sure you get your exposure and your focus correct. But I wouldn't rely too heavily on these types of things. I think it's much better to go shoot something, do the best you can to sort through these numbers and these variables, these controls, and then go back and look at those images on a much bigger screen. Because even this laptop has got a, whatever this is, I think it's a 16-inch diagonal screen. Much better than that tiny LCD on the camera. You're going to see things more clearly, so you're going to be able to check your focus. You'll be able to see the effects of your zone of focus, your depth of field. You'll be able to truly evaluate your exposure. If you're doing shots outside and you're looking at cloud density on your little tiny LCD on the camera when you're on the beach, it's really hard to know for sure if you've really nailed it. Get it home, get it on a bigger screen, and then look at it, then start doing your evaluation. So shoot something. If you can make note somehow of your exposure settings and stuff on a frame by frame basis, that would be a good thing. Some of these cameras will put the metadata in the file, and you can access the metadata in software like Lightroom. I think you can access you can access the metadata in Premiere, because you can change it and label it. You can go in and look at your exposure data sometimes in the image file itself. But if you just jot it down, I like to keep one of these little guys with me. As a camera assistant, I always had one of these in my pocket anyway for notes on all kinds of stuff relevant to the department. Buy more film, don't forget the film break at 5 p.m., stuff like that. And just make notes for yourself, and then compare your notes, look at your images, remember what the situation was you were dealing with. And over time, you'll really get good at this, and you'll be able to master these elements on the fly in the moment of doing things, as opposed to, going back and being sort of reminiscent of what you did and how you arrived at the correct settings and stuff. It's a little bit of a process. The sooner you can master it, I think the better, the more accessible the rest of cinematography will be to you as a trade. Once you get used to dealing with the numbers and applying them, and then, all of these concepts you kind of get bombarded with, it'll all start to gel, but it will take a little time. So give yourself the benefit of knowing that you're not going to get it right out of the starting gate. It's going to take a little bit of time. And if you're moving forward with this stuff beyond the introductory aspects of this class, it's just going to take you a little while to really have a firm grasp of what's going on, and it's okay. I think I mean, I got my first 35mm camera when I was 14. So, you know, I started trying to wrap my head around the concept of depth of field at a very young age. And it took a while, you know, taking pictures, you know, getting them developed, looking at the results, trying to understand why 1.8 looked soft and out of focus and why 5.6 looked much sharper. And then just trial and error, trial and error. So you're not going to get it right away. Don't worry about it. All I ask is that you keep an open mind and listen to what I have to say about these concepts and do your best to understand them. Do your best to, you know, make observations and things that make sense to you that'll help you sort of absorb this information and then give it a little time. Okay. How do you feel about the concept of lenses overall? Because it occurs to me that, you know, for those of you who are kind of hearing these things for the first time or attacking these problems for the first time, using cinema cameras for the first time, I think it really helps to go back and understand where you're coming from. I think some of you might be coming from strictly this ecosystem, right? And so things like throwing focus and controlling exposure and concepts of depth of field, I think are going to be quite alien to you if this has been your frame of reference for the whole time. So when I start talking to you about lenses and things, the best thing you can do for yourself is, you know, start going and checking out this kind of gear from the school when you have a project, and go out and use it and work with it, because that's the kind of stuff, those are the tools you're going to see more often than not when you get out into the professional world, where people are renting gear, bringing it in for jobs, shooting jobs within a time frame, producing, editing, finishing, and releasing to client. You're going to find that tools like this aren't really conducive to that kind of environment of manipulation, editing, color correction, and out of sequence shooting and assembly. So it behooves you to sort of wean yourself off of this as soon as you can, and if nothing else, I mean, at least master this level of access by the end of this semester. Give yourself the opportunity, if you haven't, for the recent shooting assignment, to check one of these cameras out and go out and play with it and use it, you know, and then move up to the next system that is available to you as you take more courses in the program. And really get yourself acclimated to these tools, because they're going to be the mainstay moving forward. Okay. And occasionally, you know, you may return to this as a novelty out in the professional world, but it won't be your day-to-day access to the industry. It just won't be. Okay. So that's really all I have to say about gear. Get comfortable with gear. Don't let it scare you or intimidate you in any way. It's just equipment. It's just, you know, it only does what you ask it to do, right? So just like when you're getting used to a new app or a new computer or something, just understand that, you know, the tool is only there to help you do your job. And, you know, it's better tools will give you more access to creativity, more flexibility, and so forth, and also more control. You know, what you don't want is to be in an industry where you are pursuing clients who are going to pay you based on your creative insight or your style or whatever, and then defer all of that to a platform like a computer or a camera. You know, that makes no sense. So we need to understand the manual aspects of all of these tools so that we can manage our creative vision more effectively when we get out into the world. So that's, you know, that's the level of importance that, you know, that it has. And take it slow, you know, just let it kind of sink in. So depth of focus is something that I want you to, it's the next thing I want you to start wrapping your head around. And it works very much part and parcel with your lenses. if I did a quick Google search here this morning, just to bring up some images that represent. So I Googled shallow depth of focus, right? And so these are the types of things that we're going to start seeing, right? We're going to start seeing blurry backgrounds, focal point, blurry background. This is what we call separation. So we have a colorful leaf in the foreground. We have an out of focus background. So, you know, right away, we're telling the audience, don't look back here. There's nothing for you to see back here. This is the message. What am I trying to say? You know, psilocybin, you know, delicious shiitake, you know, casserole, whatever your message is, fall, you know, whatever your focal point is expressing to your audience. The message is here, not back here, not back here, right here. Okay. And that's a really important tool. I mean, it's good when you have an actor delivering an important line that's very expressive, that might culminate the whole meaning behind your film. It's important when you have a specific detail that you want the audience to really take note of, because it hinges on understanding the entire scene, whatever that is. You know, think of the Matrix, you know, when we had bullet time in the first movie, right? And the whole point was that the director wanted you to understand that this guy now controlled his universe to the point where, you know, oh God, please, he could, you know, control the reality. He could slow down bullets coming out of a gun, right? And so being able to control what's in focus and what's out of focus to express a very complex thought like that in a movie is super important, right? So I think there was even at one point, there was a close up of the bullet itself. I was hoping to find that, but it's just not kind of here. So this is another way for us, just like using lighting. We're going to talk about that next week, using lighting, using exposure, using filters. Now we're talking about, you know, exactly what's going to be in resolved, focused image for the audience. What are they seeing? What are they not seeing? That's super important in terms of cinematography, and in terms of photography in general. The subjective nature of the camera versus the objective nature of the camera. So I can take this camera and I can sit it in the back corner of the room and I can shoot a scene, and we can see edge to edge, corner to corner, everybody in the shot at the same time, and watch the action transpire from an omnipotent point of view. But that doesn't really get our audience engaged, right? The minute we get inside of the action and we start seeing, you know, things from you know, a closer relationship, and we start isolating things in the frame and eliminating things from the frame, now we're starting to really tailor the message that the audience is receiving. So creating a focal point and then separating that focal point, whatever it is, if it's a person or an object, from the rest of the environment, starts controlling the message. We're telling the audience this is important, right? So this is a really handy tool to be able to master. Okay. So I want to take you to my opening sort of images here. So depth of field. So we call this depth of field, right? Zone of focus is another phrase to describe what's happening here. Sometimes I'll use depth of field and depth of focus, those two phrases interchangeably. Okay, I'm just talking about a volume of space around the subject that will be obviously sharp to the viewer, and then there's going to be degrees of fall off in sharpness in front of and behind that focal point, and in front of or behind that subject. Okay, so I'm using a pool cue right here in this opening frame to sort of illustrate that point. So The actual pool cue tip itself is the point of focus, right? And then there's a cue ball, and there looks like there might be a 15 ball here in the foreground, and they're out of focus. And as you go up the shaft of the pool cue, you can see that it's not sharp. We don't see the wood grain. We can't even read, any labeling that might be wrapped around the tip. We only see the little blue leather pad on the very end with the blue chalk on it, and it's in focus. So the depth of field is determined by several factors. So we can control how much of this image is in focus, foreground to background, by manipulating some of the same variables we were manipulating for exposure control. So the factors that are controlling depth of field now are going to be your aperture, right? So we were talking about aperture last time, as far as, controlling the size of the diaphragm in our lenses to give us a sense of, how much light is passing through the lens. Well, the phenomenon of depth of field happens in coordination with this setting. So I want to start to give you some idea of why certain settings are, going to be more important than others in certain situations. The actual focal length of the lens is going to be a contributing factor to our depth of field. So this is a 35 millimeter Rokinon, right? It's considered a wide field of view. Okay. So the larger those numbers get, we should get a sense of a narrowing of the field of view as the numbers get higher and higher and higher. So 35 millimeter is going to have a wider field of view than 50 millimeter, which has a wider field of view than 85 millimeter. Okay. And vice versa. 24 has an even a wider field of view than 35. 12 has an even wider field of view than 24. Okay. Focal length is going to help us control depth of field. Aperture is going to help us control depth of field. And then one other factor that has a lot to do with how much zone of focus we're going to have is the relative distances, camera to subject and subject to background. Okay. So the camera to subject distance is going to address issues of relative focus in the foreground of an image. And then subject to background is going to address the issue of relative focus on the backgrounds in an image, right? So the fact that this image of a pool stick and a pool ball on a pool table, obviously there's green felt, it's not in focus, but we have a strong sense of the pool table surface itself. And so we're probably in a pool hall, but there's absolutely no detail in the background in this particular image to denote that. That's all part of the aspect of depth of field focus control, and it has to do with the lenses that we're selecting and the f-stops we're shooting at. Okay, so that's the opening. So we're talking about using this now as a means of creative expression. As we move forward and start applying lenses and f-stops and relative distance to our depth of field, we can add another layer of complexity to this conversation by saying the size of your camera sensor can also contribute to, well, that one's hard to see. I always pull this camera and it's really hard to see the sensor. But the size of that sensor is going to relate in large part to how much depth of field or zone of focus you can achieve on a digital camera. Okay, so we're going to talk about all of these aspects today and see if we can arrive at an understanding and a useful sense of how this can help you create your images. So as focal length, distance, or the f number increases, in other words, as that number on your f-stop wheel gets bigger, right, the depth of field increases, or the zone of focus around your subject increases. Increasing the size of the aperture, which means using a smaller number, which corresponds to a larger lens opening, right? So 1.2 on this lens, or is it 1.6? 1.5. So 1.5 on this lens is the widest aperture opening I can achieve with this lens. And as I close it down and take a percentage of the overall area, by going down to something like whatever that is, f16, right? You can see how small that aperture opening is now. And think about that like squinting your eyes, okay? So increasing the size of the aperture gives you less zone of focus in front of and behind your subject, and using the small size openings or the larger numbers increases the amount that's in focus from the foreground to the background, like squinting would do, right? And then part and parcel with that idea, smaller capture devices, smaller sensors like the one on the GH5 will inherently have more sharpness from foreground to background than the Super 35 sensor in the Ursa Mini 4.6K. And even less again in the Canon 5D with the huge 24 by 36 millimeters sensor, right? So large sensors can give you a shallow depth of field look, more. You could arrive at those solutions more quickly if you're using lenses. Well, let's get into it, and I'll do the exact comparisons. Just understand that a smaller sensor is inherently has more sharpness than a larger sensor. Okay. Now, don't confuse that with plane of focus. Okay, because that's the other thing I want to talk to you about is plane of focus. So you see we got the 11 ball right here on a pool table. We got a striker in the background. He's getting ready to break. Number 11 and the highlight in the ball and the stripe on the ball, perfectly sharp, right? Because we've set the plane of focus to be at whatever this distance was from the camera. Maybe it was 1.5 feet, 2 feet, you know. The plane of focus was here. The foreground has a very short area between camera and pool ball and the number 11 ball, maybe 1.5 feet, but the distance from the plane of focus or the subject to the background is much greater, okay? When the foreground distance or camera to subject distance is very short and the distance from the subject to the background is great, it's easier for you to throw that background out of focus, okay? But as your plane of focus shifts or moves toward the background, like if that pool ball was to scoot back 3 feet, right? And the guy stayed in the same position and the background doesn't move, obviously. And then we shift the focus to the new position for the 11 ball. We're going to be able to bring this guy into sharp focus relative to the pool ball because he's going to be very close behind the pool ball at that point in time. And because the zone of focus has shifted towards the background, we'll start to see more in the background become sharper and in focus. So the relative distance to camera is going to have a lot to do with how much depth of field we can achieve as well. Okay, so if we think about this concept from the point of view of the aperture, so here's the internal workings of I think this is a Nikon lens. This is what your diaphragm looks like inside the build of the lens itself, right? And it's just a series of blades and they close down and they form this little opening. And the opening corresponds to the numbers on the outside of the barrel, okay? And that's all well and good. So this is creating the situation where we're allowing light through in a certain amount of volume. And we're using it to control our exposure. And then the wider the opening, the more we can bring the background into focus while keeping the foreground in focus as well. Okay, so if we start with a really big opening, we get something similar to this result, right? The pool ball's in focus, the balls in the background are softly out of focus. And then as this hole gets smaller, we'll be able to draw detail into the image from back here whilst maintaining sharpness here at the same time. All right. I give you a PDF in web courses for you guys to download or to just read and look at. It's from my article in January at Videomaker, which is titled Everything You Want to Know About Depth of Field, right? Everything you need to know about depth of field. So if you go to videomaker.com, you can access the article there. I've given you a PDF version of it on web courses and you can read it there. Okay. If you go to the Videomaker website, you get all the other nifty little things that they're doing. Like this is their video that they produced on depth of field. And then this is the article that I wrote dealing with the concepts. So in the article, I'm talking about the 3 factors, right? Lens, aperture, and subject to camera distance. And I'm describing and defining for you the plane of focus. Okay. And then I start breaking it down for you. I really like this illustration, if this helps at all, to get you more sort of up to speed on the concept. Depth of field, right? If we try to define it, depth of field is going to be a zone of apparent focus in front of and behind our subject. And it has to do with the plane of focus relative to the camera subject distance, which is this distance right here. Okay. So in this illustration, this is from Expert Photography. In this illustration, they got our little photographer guy right here. There's a puppy in the foreground. There's a little girl in the background. Looks like she's tossing a ball or something. We have a tree in the deep background. So this actually, I call this background. This is middle ground, foreground, middle ground, and background. So there's a tree in the background, a girl in the middle ground, a puppy in the foreground. And then this guy's shooting at an f2.8 outside during the day. We can assume other things are consistent, like, 60th of a second shutter speed to match our 24 frames per second and all of that interesting stuff. And then we're just going to talk about how at different f-stops, this zone of focus will extend into the foreground or extend into the background based on how we set that aperture. Okay. So this is another way to think about this concept by using this little graph. So I think that helps a lot. So if we want to try and define depth of field, in my article, I say, let's start by describing what it is or what it's not, right? So its depth of field is not a tangible thing. So it's not something that you're going to be able to see or put your hands on, right? It's an optical phenomenon that is the result of how you set the camera. All right. So the only way you're going to see depth of field at work is in the final images. Okay. But you can sort of understand the results you're going to get if you understand how the factors contribute to depth of field. All right. Think about depth of field as a condition resulting from a set of conditions relating to a photograph and its visual arrangement. It describes an area of acceptable focus around a subject placed at a specific distance from the lens. The phenomenon occurs with the adjustments of the lens diaphragm. And that diaphragm is comprised of tiny blades and a small opening. So that's basically my clinical analysis of what depth of field is. And then I'm going to talk to you about it in the article as well, aperture, controlling the size of the depth of field and so forth. I've got a neat app I'm going to show you today as well that'll help you practice this concept and wrap your head around how the zone of focus will change, get bigger and smaller based on how you set the lens. Okay, so I'll refer to back and forth, I think, to this article as we talk about this morning as well. Here, I think I showed you part of this video before when we were talking about the aperture. If you recall, it talks about depth of field towards the end of this. So I'm going to run this for you again to refresh your memory, and then I want to talk to you about some of these cells you're going to recognize from last week. I'm going to talk to you about the lens again. So let me run this to refresh your memory here.
What is aperture? Perhaps the most influential parameter of photography, aperture plays an important role in composition and setting up a shot. Let's take a closer look. Simply put, aperture is the hole in the lens through which light travels into the camera body and onto the camera sensor. To understand, let's look at the human eye. All cameras are designed like human eyes. The cornea of our eye is similar to the front element of the lens, gathering light and bending it inward toward the iris. The iris can expand or shrink, controlling the size of the pupil, which passes light into the inner eye. The pupil is what we refer to as the aperture in photography. The amount of light that falls onto the retina is determined by the size of the pupil. The larger the pupil, the more light falls onto the retina. The larger the aperture of the lens, the more light enters the camera. The iris of the lens controls the size of the aperture and is called the diaphragm. The diaphragm's function is to block all light with the exception of the light that goes through the aperture. In photography, aperture is expressed in f numbers, also known as f-stops. F-stops are a way of describing how open or closed the aperture is. The smaller the f-stop means a larger aperture, while a larger f-stop means a smaller aperture. This can be tricky to remember since large f-stops mean small aperture sizes. So an f-stop of f1.4 is larger than f2.8 and much larger than f8 or f11. Aside from controlling the amount of light passing through the lens and into the camera, the aperture has a direct impact on the depth of field, the area of the image that appears sharp. A large f number such as f16 will bring all foreground and background objects into focus, while a small f number such as f1.4 will isolate either the foreground or background objects and make everything else blurry. Every lens has a limit on how large or small the aperture can get. If you take a look at the specifications of your lens, it should indicate the maximum apertures, lowest f numbers, and minimum apertures, highest f numbers. The maximum aperture of the lens is much more important than the minimum aperture because it shows the speed of the lens. Lenses with apertures of f1.4 or f2.8 are considered fast lenses because they can pass more light into the camera than, for example, a lens with a maximum aperture of f4 or f5.6. That's the reason night photography usually requires fast lenses. The minimum aperture of a lens is usually not important and should rarely be used as diffraction will cause the image to lose clarity. It is also worth noting the two types of lenses, primes and zooms. Prime lenses have a fixed focal length, meaning they cannot zoom without physically moving closer or further away from the subject. Zoom lenses give you the flexibility for you to zoom in or out of an object while remaining stationary. While prime lenses will have a fixed maximum aperture, the maximum aperture of a zoom lens will often get smaller as the focal length increases. These lenses are called variable aperture lenses. This is important because for a zoom lens with a focal length of 70 to 200 millimeters, the aperture may increase from f3.5 to f5.6, decreasing the amount of light entering the camera. Because aperture controls the amount of light entering the camera, it also affects other parameters such as ISO and shutter speed. A larger aperture or smaller f number will let more light into the camera, allowing you to use a faster shutter speed or lower ISO value. This is beneficial to eliminate motion blur and reduce the amount of noise that your camera will produce.
Okay, so hopefully you remember that video. And the last time we watched it, it was in context of exposure. So we were talking about the aperture, and I really wanted you to think about how the aperture controls the amount of light coming through the lens so that you can make your image brighter or darker. Now, I want to extend the conversation to include this concept of shallow or deep depth of field relevant to the size of the aperture. So I showed you this diagram and talked to you about the relationship between the aperture sizes and the volume of light that's coming through the lens. And now I also want you to think about the relationship between these sizes as an increase or a decrease in the zone of focus around your subject. So a big opening is minimal zone of focus around your subject. Your subject also means your focus plane. Okay, so I may say subject or I may say focus plane. I'm talking about the same thing more or less. Okay, when you use a big opening, you have less zone of focus around your focus plane or your image plane. And if you use a small opening, you get more zone of focus around that subject or image plane. Okay. In reality, if we're outside in the bright sun, we can close down our aperture. We get less light through the lens that strikes the sensor. This will prevent overexposure. The scene can look dark. In reality, we can open up the aperture to let more light in. This will allow as much light through as possible. We can also balance our exposure and avoid digital noise, but we also get this really great shallow depth of focus look where The background is softly, gently out of focus, and it's helping to direct our eye to the foreground, right? We're helping in a very gentle, subtle way, direct the audience's attention to the girl outside in the field. Not anything else out here that might be relevant to another conversation. The conversation we're trying to have is, this person is out wandering around in the wild, whatever these are, wild oats. And, we want the audience to key in on this information. Okay. This is the scale of F numbers, the standard scale from 1 to 22, right? F1 to F22. Get used to seeing this group of numbers and understand that lens to lens, it's pretty much going to be more or less the same. You're either going to see 1.0, 1.4, 1.8, maybe 2.0 as your maximum aperture size. And then you're going to have a group of numbers from that starting point to your smallest aperture, which will generally on your motion picture lenses be about f16. Sometimes you get f22, a really, really small pinhole sized aperture. Most of it is f16. So you're going to see this range of numbers usually somewhere between f2 and f16 fairly reliably on pretty much any device you're working with. You don't have to necessarily memorize them. I think you're going to see them on a fairly regular basis, enough so that you'll be able to think about the scale of numbers without needing a little cheat sheet. This illustration is really great for starting to understand the zone of focus concept. How much zone of focus is around the 10 ball? Well, at a very wide open aperture, the foreground 11 ball is out of focus, and in the background, almost immediately behind the 10 ball, this yellow ball. What's the yellow ball, guys? It's 15 is what? Is 15 yellow? I'm not sure.
Could be 9.
9
I
ball
remember correctly.
Okay. So it's also out of focus, right? So at a very wide open aperture, we've eliminated detail in the foreground and detail immediately behind the subject. Never mind the deep background, that's way out of focus. But the yellow striped ball is also gently out of focus, and that's pretty nice. If we're having a conversation about the 10 ball, and we want the audience to think about, how's the 10 ball feeling today? Or how is the player going to hit the cue ball and get it to bounce off the 10 ball and still avoid the 11 and avoid the 9 on the way to whatever, that's the corner pocket back there, maybe, right? Or maybe he's going for the side pocket over here. So the point is, we're thinking about the relationship now, the player to the 10 ball, and this is the point of view of the person who's trying to get the 10 ball into the side pocket, let's say. Okay, we can control the depth of focus, so the audience knows it's about this ball. He's not shooting for this one. He's not shooting for that one. He's shooting for this one. Okay. Depth of field is the distance around the plane of focus where objects appear acceptably sharp in an image. Not necessarily perfectly sharp, just acceptably sharp. Sharp enough for us to get the message. Okay. Although the optical imaging system can precisely focus on one plane at a time, we can decrease the sharpness in gradual increments as each side of the point of focus, foreground or background, is brought into the conversation depending on the f-stop we're using. Okay. It may be desirable to have the entire image sharp, and a large depth of field is appropriate, like exteriors outside, where you're seeing a wide establishing shot of the front of a building or the edge of a mountain, or a stream where people are fishing. You don't want stuff to be grossly out of focus in a wide establishing shot, because for that style of imagery, we want the audience to look at the whole big picture, because we're talking about the environment that our story is taking place within, right? So if it's a story about fly fishing, we want them to see the stream in focus, the guy in the middle ground, casting. We want to see the water, sort of rushing by in the foreground. We want the trees and the mountain to be in focus in the background, because we're talking about fly fishing, being out in nature, right? And so we want to see the whole establishing shot as being sharp and in focus. But as the lens starts to move in on finer detail, as the story starts to describe in finer detail some aspect of the overall world, you know, what kind of flies is the guy using to catch bass that day might be the subject of your video, right? So once we get out of that establishing sensibility, describing the world and where we're at, our images start to get smaller and closer up in detail. The lens starts moving closer, the camera starts moving closer, and then we need less and less of the world in focus and more of the critical detail in focus, right? Okay, depth of field can be creatively controlled as an aspect of our compositional needs at this point. What do we want to see? What do we want to exclude? Use depth of field to help us make the point. This is a great little image right here. The word depth of field is at the plane of focus. And then because a very wide open aperture was used, the text on the page as it recedes towards the background gets more and more out of focus. And in the foreground, as the foreground increases, it gets more and more out of focus, right? And this is a really great illustration of how it happens in degrees, right? Extreme focus, slightly out, even more out, grossly out, and ridiculously out of focus, right? It's getting worse and worse as the zone of focus sort of dissipates around that subject. And again, think of it as that blue zone, right? The little girl with the ball and the dog. Where was it? Here, right? At a 2.8, we get a little bit in front and a little bit behind the subject. At a 16, we get a lot in front and a lot behind the subject. At f16, the tree in the background is as sharp as the dog in the foreground and the girl in the middle. But at a 2.8, the dog is softly out of focus and so is the tree in the background. Okay. Circles of confusion. It's an interesting concept. It's very similar to depth of field in that it's describing the actual point of focus on the sensor or on a strip of film, right? At the precise point of focus, which has to, if you can think of your sensor as a screen, right? And you're projecting onto that screen through the lens, just like you have to, you know, focus a projector so your movie is sharp on the movie screen. The lens is focusing the image on the image plane so that the detail can be registered on the sensor, on the pixels, and it can be recorded as a sharp image, right? So if that distance, which has to be very precise, if that distance is off by a small amount, it can throw the image out of focus. Circle of confusion is kind of an advanced concept. I don't want you to dwell on it so much, but you'll hear this phrase, circle of confusion, when we talk about another concept, which is not really directly related to circle of confusion, but is sometimes interchangeably used with the concept of circle of confusion, which is bokeh. Okay, or bokeh, depending on how you want to describe it. Okay, I'm going to talk to you about bokeh. But as far as circle of confusion is concerned, it's a relatively small degree of measurement where the image can be slightly out of focus at the image plane inside the camera at the point of the sensor. All right, and there's a threshold of tolerance there where you can be slightly incorrect and still have the image in acceptably sharp focus. Okay, when you hear circle of confusion, just think about it as a degree of tolerance between in focus and out of focus. How much is that measurement? It's very small. It's in microns. Okay, and it's not quite the same thing as bokeh. Okay, so when you hear folks mention circle of confusion, 9 times out of 10 they're really talking about this. Okay, which is different. They call these circles of confusion, and they're not really, but what they are point sources of light in the background that start to become more and more unresolved or out of focus with larger aperture openings. And what we get is the effect of seeing the point source of light as an element of out of focus detail in the background that can bear some aspects of the aperture that the light is passing through. If you look at this highlight on this panel on the right, you see how you can kind of see the sides of the aperture. It's getting that stop sign effect, we call it. We're getting flat spots, and over here at the wide open aperture, it's more like a perfect circle, more or less, right? So if you could imagine light coming through your 50 millimeter lens, and you got your aperture all the way open, right, to, you know, something very bright, like this is 1.5, I think, T15, right? You can see how this is called the exit pupil. This is where the light comes out of the back of the lens and projects onto the sensor. If you look through the lens from this side, you can see right down the barrel, and you can see how that you know, the optics are perfectly round. There's nothing in the way of the path of the light, right? So if something is really, really out of focus in the background, it's going to sort of appear like a little round blob, because there's nothing impairing the path of the light through the lens. And as you close that aperture down and we start introducing the blades of the diaphragm, you can start seeing how a point source or a highlight in the background that is really, really out of focus might have the stop sign effect, because you can see that the opening the light's passing through is starting to develop flat spots from the actual aperture itself. You see that? And that's why your out of focus bokeh balls can have that stop sign effect. It has to do with your mid-range f-stops generally, like f4 to 5. Well, yeah. On this lens, since our maximum opening is a 1.5 at a 2.8, which is here, you can start to see the flat spots emerging, right? So if you shoot at a 2.8 on this lens, your bokeh in the background of your shot, if it's far enough away and out of focus enough, can have the stop sign effect. But on the other hand, some lenses only open as wide as a 2.8. See if I've got one of those here. Well, here's one that opens to a 3.5, which is like a 2.8.5. It's an 18 millimeter lens. And if I show you, this will be a little harder to see because it's a smaller. If I open this all the way to 3.5, which like I said is 2.8.5, you can see how the optical path is perfectly round, right? But 2.8.5 on this lens, which is somewhere in the middle of 2.8 and 4, 2.8.5 on this lens is giving you the stop sign effect. All right. This lens can only open as wide as 2.8.5. But when you use it at 2.8.5, you get round bokeh. And then as you close down your aperture, oops, where's my depth of field preview? There we go. As you close down your aperture, you start to see the stop signs emerge. So there's wide open at 2.8.5. There's 4, 5, 6, 8, 11, 16 is all the way closed. Okay. So you'll get, if you want really round bokeh, you have to select a lens to shoot with that's not going to start in the middle of the range. So the range is that set of numbers I asked you to keep in mind back here, right? You see how the lenses can start as bright as a 1.0 f-stop and start as dark as a 2.8 or even a 4, right? I have some lenses. This one's a 2.8.5. 3.5 is almost an f4. It's almost starting in the middle of the f-stop range. And when it does that, the minute you go one f-stop darker from 3.5 to 5.6, like that, bang, you're going to start seeing the stop sign effect. Oops, I have to keep pushing this button to see that. All right, so here again is wide open. Here's a 5.6, bang. The first time we close the lens down, we get the stop sign effect. So if you want these nice, soft, out of focus bokeh balls in the background of your image, make sure you choose what we call a bright lens, a lens that can open to a really wide f-stop, like a 1.5 is good. Okay, a 1.4 if it's a photographic lens, f1.4, t1.5, f1.0 if you're talking about some of the more expensive stuff from Carl Zeiss, for instance. Canon has a 50mm 1.2 maximum f-stop, very, very bright. Aperture opens very, very wide, lets a lot of light through. Autofocus backgrounds will be nice and soft and round on a lens like that. Okay. Some of your kit lenses that you buy, if you buy a Canon T2i, for instance, and you get it in a kit with a Canon 28 to 135, let's say, well, that lens, the maximum aperture is a lot like this 18. It's a 3.5, and then it's variable aperture. So it's only 3.5 at 28mm, which is your wide field of view. As you zoom in to the narrow field of view of 135mm, your maximum aperture is effectively 5.6 or 6.3. I forget which one. Quite dark, actually, because in a zoom lens, when you go from a wide angle where all the glass is fairly compact and the light passes through in a very short optical path, you can achieve that brighter maximum aperture of 3.5. But as the lens zooms out, like in the case of this one, for instance, you know, as the lens zooms out, I can probably show you too. You can see how at, where is it, 70mm. So this is a 70 to 210. At 70mm, all the lens groupings are kind of in the front of the lens barrel, right? So the light has to pass through a very short group of glass before it can travel to the sensor. But when you go to telephoto, you can kind of see how the groupings start to expand inside the lens. And now you've got a bigger space where the glass is all kind of spaced out and the light's trying to pass through it. By the time it gets to the other side, you have taken away some of the light passing through the lens through diffraction and being absorbed on the inside of the barrel. And so your maximum aperture can no longer effectively be a 3.5. It has to be something darker, like 5.6 or 6.3. Okay, so that's why some of these photographic lenses have variable f-stops, and it's a very inexpensive way of manufacturing a lens. It takes less thinking and less engineering to get the lens to work this way than some of our cinema zooms, where the maximum aperture is the same at the wide angle end as it is at the telephoto end. It takes more engineering, more glass, more super coating on the lenses to prevent reflections and diffractions. A lot of expensive manufacturing goes into a cinema zoom to keep the aperture consistent from wide angle to telephoto, but they do exist. We do have them. We have some of them at UCF. The photographic zoom I just showed you, the 70 to 210, in its day when this was brand new, cost about $200. The cinema zooms that we have at school for you guys to use with constant apertures from wide angle to telephoto, when they were new, sold for just under $5,000 a piece. Okay, so the difference in manufacturing costs had everything to do with whether or not your aperture was going to be variable or consistent, right? If you're shooting a movie and your lighting is 2.8 in the room, you've brought in enough light to equal a 2.8 on your light meter, and you want to shoot your establishing shot on your 20mm setting on the zoom lens, and then you want to zoom in to do a close-up shot of your actor. If when you zoom in, the aperture becomes 5.6, that doesn't help you because your lighting's not bright enough and your image will look underexposed. Okay. You'll either have to add more light or you'll have to adjust your exposure settings some way to accommodate that new variable aperture of a 5.6 when you zoomed in on the lens, right? And sometimes that can be managed fairly quickly and easily, and sometimes that's a big problem, right? So be aware of the role your aperture is playing in your depth of field. Choose lenses that give you the most pleasing effect, give you the nicest out of focus highlights, but have the best light gathering power and are the easiest to control as far as exposure goes. Can you kind of see how this is all starting to tie in? exposure becomes kind of an important aspect of this conversation, even though we're only talking about whether or not we want the focus sharp or the background sharp. We have to think about exposure at the same time we think about depth of field, because they tie together directly. They're directly related. Okay. The depth of field is determined by the focal length of the lens, the aperture size, and the distance from the camera to the subject. All right, wide angle lenses, lenses with a very wide field of view, apparently show us more detail from foreground to background than telephoto lenses do, okay? Telephoto lenses are lenses that show us a magnified version of the same image. So if we had a zoom lens and we started at wide angle and zoomed into telephoto, it's really easy to illustrate the point, right? Lenses on telephoto show us less field of view, right? And within the image frame itself, we have less apparent sharpness between foreground and background. Okay. If you want to think about this concept, I have this little app to show you now, and it's very cool because it gives you this little screen here that simulates the effect of aperture on a given lens and camera sensor setup. So what we have to do is we have to set up the app for the camera and lens we're using, and then we can manipulate the controls to see how the depth of field changes. So if you go to dofsimulator.net, and I have all this in web courses and in the PDF of the decks, go to depth of field simulator, and you're going to get this screen, okay? And you're going to be able to do some stuff to this image, right? So you're going to be able to manipulate focal length and shutter speed and all this stuff to see what happens to your image. But first, we got to tell it a few things. So we're going to go to basic mode of operation, right? And then we're going to tell it what distance units we want to use. So if we were in the UK, for instance, we'd be using metric, but we're in the US, so we're going to use imperial measurements, right? Inches and feet and so forth. Then we're going to choose our avatar, right? So here's our avatar, and we have a couple of different people we can choose from. So we got two versions of dude, right? Dude 1 and dude 2. I think it really is color of hair and color of outfit, I think is the distinction there. Then we've got woman number 1, we got woman number 2. Whoops, hey, there she is. If you prefer redheads, gentlemen, there's your woman number 2. We have young girl, young boy, and then we have 2 variations of young girl and young boy. So pick your avatar, whatever you want, and this will be our subject. And then we're going to choose the camera that we're using, so the model. So I don't know if FC1000 is in here. I don't think it is, but let's see what we do have. There's a lot of Canon cameras in here. Let's see what we got for Panasonic here. Look at all those. Oh, we don't have any Panasonic. Okay, it's all going to be, oh, here we go. Panasonic. Let's see what we got for Panasonic. Here we go. FC1000 Mark II. All right. So that's this camera. That's the one that you guys can check out from UCF right now. Okay. So the FC1000, if we want to tell it the sensor size, we can do that. It is a 1-inch sensor. So let's see what we got here. 1 inch. There's our 1-inch sensor. 1-inch sensor, FC1000 from Panasonic. Now we tell it what lens we're on. So the built-in lens on the Panasonic is 25 to 400 as it translates to this particular sensor. So these are the numbers that we'll use as our guideline here. Okay, don't worry about what it says on the front of the lens. that doesn't take into account the size of the sensor. When you translate these numbers with the size of the sensor, you get this relative range here, 25 to 400. All right, so if we're at, let's go to the middle of that lens, so 25 to 400, let's say, I don't know, 75 millimeter. So I'm going to take this little control here and zoom into 75 millimeter. I can also type it directly into this box, 75, there we go. And then this is our field of view on our young boy number 2, right? And this is our relative background. We can choose that background. We can also change it over here in the menu system. In addition to portrait and landscape aspect ratio, we can also change the background right here, right? So we can go to church, which is a cathedral. We can go to inside, I think is it inside? No, it's still outside. So we got church or cathedral. We have city as a background, which is just a bunch of buildings from kind of high up in the air. So it doesn't really make sense. We were just on mountains as a backdrop. We've got Paris as a backdrop, which I think is the Louvre Museum. We've got a tree for our background. Looks like it's in the park. And we've got a building, which is like this sort of Georgian looking thing. Or we have the park. So we can be at the park as well. And the park is just an open field with some trees in the background. Either the park or I think the tree or the mountains is a good background to use. If we zoom out on tree, let's see what we get. Yeah, that's what we get in the widest. So we're on a 75 with the tree in the background. And we're on a, what did I say? We were on a 75 mil lens. All right. Now what we can do is start playing with our f-stop control, which is right below our focal length control. And if we go to a 4, we can see the background is pretty out of focus, pretty soft. And then as we go from 4 to 5, 6, we may start to see the background get sharper by degrees. Here's an 11. Here's 16. You can see the leaves and the bark now are really starting to get sharp. Here's 22. So if we were outside on a bright day at f22 on this lens, which is easy to do if you don't have an ND filter on the camera in Florida, right? You can see how sharp the bark is on the tree and how sharp the leaves are in the background. There's almost no separation, we call it, separation between the foreground and the background, right? So the kid in the foreground is sharp. The background is sharp enough to where we have detail that competes with our eye between the background and the foreground. And so this situation for your audience could be quite distracting, right? So if this is what's happening in your image and you want the subject in the foreground to be the focal point of the scene for your audience, you're probably going to want to throw this background out of focus. And so to do that, you have to be on these wider open apertures, right? But you understand the implication, right, of the wider aperture. If you needed to be at f22 to preserve the exposure of the image so that it's not too bright or overexposed, not too bright, but it's not too dark. If you need to be at f22 to maintain brightness balance, then opening up to a 4 for depth of field is gonna do what to your image? What happens when you open up your aperture from a small hole to a big hole?
It's gonna get brighter.
Pardon?
It should be getting brighter if you're opening it up more.
Yeah, it's going to get a lot brighter, I think. How many jumps is that from 22 to 4? 1, 2, 3, 4. It's 5 jumps. That's 5 f-stops of overexposure when you change from an F22 to an F4. Okay, the depth of field simulator's job is not to show you how your exposure gets ruined by making these changes. It's only trying to show you how the backgrounds can get soft or get sharp depending on the aperture you use. You have to understand the concept of exposure before you use this application, because in reality, if we merely open up the lens without changing anything else, you know that this image is going to blow out and start looking so badly overexposed that you won't even see the detail. It'll be all washed out, right? So we can't have that, right? But we can still make this work if we control other variables of the exposure. And you should know now what those variables are and what you got to do to accommodate this kind of creative decision, right? So now your f-stop's not just exposure, now it's a creative choice. So if your f-stop becomes your creative priority and you want to go from a 22 to a 4, that's what that worksheet is all about. It's like, well, what other changes could I make to the camera to allow this creative change to take precedent, right? From a 22 that I need to be in proper exposure balance to a 4, which I need more to create focus separation between the foreground and the background. So my subject kind of stands out in the foreground and my audience can key in on him right away, right? I set this to a 4, I become 5 stops overexposed. So I've got to make a 5-stop compensation in what? What things can I play with? As far as exposure on the camera, what variables can I play with?
Repeat the question, please.
If I want to change my f-stop from a 22 to a 4, what other aspects of the exposure control of the camera can I adjust to accommodate that change? Remember, there was 3 or 4 things. Pardon?
Your ISO or your shutter speed, right?
ISO, shutter speed, that's 2. There's a couple more. What else can I do?
You could throw a filter on it.
I could use what kind of filter?
ND.
ND filter, right? And there was one other thing that kind of shutter speed and shutter angle are kind of saying the same thing, but there was one other thing that could also affect the exposure being too bright or too dark. And it's something that you don't change very often. But what's that 4th thing that we could play with? Or 5th thing, I guess.
Yeah, frame rate.
Frame rate, very good, right? But what's the problem with frame rate? What's our biggest concern with frame rate?
Sound.
Sound, yes, very good. So if we're recording sound, so if our boy number 2 here has a line of dialogue that he's going to say to somebody standing right next to the lens, right next to camera, we got to lock in that frame rate, don't we? It has to be a specific frame rate. Does anybody remember? What frame rate is that?
To keep sound correct?
Yeah.
24.
24, right?
24p, right? 24 progressive. That's 24 frames a second. That will ensure that the lip flap looks good on the screen. Remember that? So he's saying words and the lips appear to be working in sync with what we hear with our ear when we watch the projection, right? 24p is our frame rate that we lock in if we're recording dialogue. Okay. So if we want to make this change in our f-stop here, we can't do anything with our frames per second. That has to be 24, right? I'm playing with the aperture. So that leaves us what? ISO, shutter angle, and shutter speed. And these two are really kind of the same thing. And the shutter angle and shutter speed are tied to what? They can be tied to the frame rate of 24p. What's our gold standard exposure setting for the camera when we record sound? Do you remember what it was? It was a group of settings. This is from Wednesday. 180-degree shutter, 24 frames per second, 1/48, which is the sort of same way of referring to 180-degree shutter, right? And then we have two other things. We got your ISO and we got your aperture. What was unique about the ISO? The ISO had something called a native setting. Remember that?
That's the one that whoever made it, they said this is the best place to start with your ISO, right?
Yeah, the manufacturer has created that camera or that sensor specifically to operate best at a given ISO, which we call the native ISO. So like with the Panasonic GH5, I think the native ISO of that camera is 400. The Pocket 4K, the native ISO is 800. It's actually got two, 800 or I think the other is 2500, right? So it has a low sensitivity ISO and a high sensitivity ISO. So if you're shooting in normal lighting conditions, you use the native ISO of 800 as a base with this camera, right? It'll vary slightly from camera to camera. The native ISO on the Ursa Mini 4.6K is 400 ISO, right? The FC1000, I think the native ISO on this one is 800. Okay, so you're going to start there. And because the manufacturer says you'll get your best image results at that native ISO, you probably lock that in. So if we were going to manipulate this exposure going from an f22 to an f4 in this example to get this background soft for this kid, the smartest thing we might do would be to employ our variable neutral density filter so that we can select the wider open aperture of a 4 and then turn that variable neutral density filter 5 stops worth of rotation, and it's marked on the filter barrel itself. Like this is I think this is a 9-stop neutral density filter, and it has a minimum and maximum designation on the ring. You see here it says minimum, that's minimum effect, and then maximum effect, right? And you see that little arrow, and as I turn the filter, I can go from the least amount of neutral density to the most amount of neutral density. And I think this range, even though there's a whole bunch of little square witness marks there, I think the range is 9 f-stops. So it's 0 correction to, maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to 9, although the maximum density of the filter. In other words, remember I turned it and showed you how it got black and then it got sort of clear again as you rotate it, right? So you can dial in up to 9 stops of reduction here. Well, we only need 5 stops. So we would turn it until we got, about 5 stops of neutral density dialed into the filter at f4. And then you'll see your image is nicely balanced again in terms of brightness. But we are now at a new aperture, which is much wider, allowing more light to pass through the lens, compensated with the variable ND filter. And now the background can be nicely out of focus. You see how that works? So do you kind of understand why I had to talk to you about exposure control first before I talked to you about depth of field? Because I can talk to you about depth of field all day long, but if you don't understand the relationship of the f-stops and the ISO and the neutral density filters and all of that, how are you going to control these details? So the neutral density filter, I think, would be your best course of action. If you didn't have a neutral density filter, though, you can change the ISO of your camera. You can certainly do that, right? What are the drawbacks of manipulating ISO? What happens to the image when you start playing games with the ISO setting?
It can get noisy.
Yeah, you get that grainy, noisy look in the image, remember? So that's probably something you don't want. Unless you don't mind, sometimes a background like leaves like this, it might be harder to see the effects of noise or grain in the image against all that detail in the background. But as it goes more and more out of focus, the grain will become more and more apparent. So that's the trade-off with ISO, is you're going to get noisy images. if we said, okay, I won't play with the ISO, what else can I play with? Well, I don't have a variable ND filter. I locked in my ISO. I locked in my frame rate. I could manipulate the shutter speed or the shutter angle of the camera, but at different shutter angles, the shutter speed changes, remember? And if I use a really wide, if I go wider than 180 degrees on the shutter opening, do you remember what happens to the effective shutter speed of the camera with a much wider shutter opening? If the shutter's open longer, what's going on with the light? Is less light or more light going to hit the sensor with a shutter angle that's been increased beyond 180?
More.
More light's coming through, right? And it's coming through. In order to balance that out, the shutter speed's gonna kind of change, right? To something, if more light's coming through the lens, the shutter speed's going to have to become quicker because we're compensating for an increased volume of light coming through. If we narrow the shutter angle down and we let less light coming through, then the shutter speed might get slower, right? In order to compensate or balance again for less light coming through. And we get, something happens when we play games with the shutter speed on the camera, right? You remember what happens with the image? If the shutter speed gets too fast, if the effective shutter speed gets too fast, what does the image kind of remind you of? Or what happens to the image?
Doesn't it go in slow motion?
With faster shutter speeds, the image,
Oh,
something happens to the image. Do you remember it getting kind of stroby like in the Saving Private Ryan footage? It gets real sharp. In other words, the faster shutter speeds are freezing more of the inherent motion from frame to frame as your subject moves through the frame. So you get less motion blur with faster shutter speeds, and it kind of makes the image look more stroby or hyper real in that sense. If the shutter speed gets slower than 1/48, which is 24, the speed at 24p, if the shutter speed gets slower than that, what happens to the image? Do you remember the stuff from Christopher Doyle from Chungking Express I showed you?
Oh yeah, it's kind of like washed out looking, like smoother in that way.
Smoother, or try different metaphors?
It's like really jumpy, I think.
It was kind of blurry. Remember the image kind of smearing and blurring through the frame because we increased the amount of time the shutter was open, meaning a slower shutter speed. And when the shutter is open for longer, letting light to build on the sensor to give you a balanced exposure, motion is happening while the shutter is open, right? That's that image blur we talk about. And if the motion is happening while the shutter is open, it smears the detail and makes everything look, I think Zach, you put it as smooth. I would use blurry as a different kind of metaphor. And so that's what we call dragging the shutter. So the shutter is open longer to accommodate more light passing through for good exposure. But in the process, the subject is moving through the frame and blurring in essence because the shutter speed is too slow. So it's a game we're going to play with the shutter speed or shutter angle if we start using that as our means of controlling exposure. So we probably don't want to do that. So really that means the best option is your variable ND filter. So that becomes a critical tool, I think, in our exposure considerations moving forward. That's why I asked UCF to buy as many of them as they could possibly buy, so that with every camera that we check out now moving forward, if you want to take these cameras to the beach where you got a lot of light, but you want to shoot shallow depth of focus close-ups like we got here on boy number 2, you're definitely going to need that variable ND filter. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to pull it off because some aspect of your image quality will suffer when you manipulate the other variables concerned with exposure control, right? So that's the justification for this app, but the app is very powerful in many regards. We can play with the aperture, we can play with the focal length. So remember I told you lenses with a wider field of view are going to seem like the backgrounds can be sharply in focus more easily. Here's a 35 millimeter lens. So we were just on a 75. Now we're on a 35. This lens will open as wide as what? 25 millimeters. Let's go to 25 millimeters for a minute and see what that looks like. So here's 25 millimeters. So the field of view got a lot wider at 25, didn't it? What kind of shot framing is this? You remember from your shooting assignment?
I want to say full, but I feel like it'd be a wide.
Well, we're not going to use the term wide when we're talking about framing because we can confuse that term with other things like lenses and stuff. So let's reserve wide to our lens sort of, what do you want to call that? Our lens lexicon. And let's talk about shot framing in different ways. Let's talk about it. You could say full body shot, you know, that's fair, right? But if you really want to use the industry speak, we're going to call this a long shot. Okay. Boy number 2 is standing in the foreground of this image, and we can see him from head to toe with a little bit of headroom. This area up here is called headroom. Okay. How much headroom does he have? In a long shot, we see the subject from head to toe with a little bit of headroom, right? If boy number 2 was standing across the street and the camera didn't move, he just went across the street and we saw, you know, more area around him, over his head and below his feet, like all this foreground and everything in the background, we would call that an extreme long shot or an ELS. Okay. But this is a long shot. This framing is called a long shot. So we're on a 25 millimeter lens in a long shot of boy number 2. And look at the f-stop is still at a 4. We left that the way it was from the last example. Now, if we want that background to be out of focus on this lens, we can't do it. This is as out of focus as it's going to get because that lens has a maximum opening of 3.2, and on 25 millimeter, it's just not going to work, right? We can't get that background out of focus. So let's think about how depth of field is controlled. It's controlled by the size of the sensor on the camera. It's controlled by the choice of aperture. And there was one other thing that can control depth of field. Do you remember what I told you it was? It's sort of illustrated by this little diagram at the bottom of my page. You see this down here? Do you see
Your
the
distance to the subject.
camera to subject distance, right? So camera to subject distance in this particular illustration is about 10 feet, right? So if I want that background to be out of focus, I could move in. Let's see what happens when I move the photographer closer. Look at that. Now I'm only 5 feet away. The background got softer, but oh man, what happened to my focal length? My field of view changed again. Now we're in a medium shot. We're framing a medium shot. So my background is softer, agreeably, but I can't do that on a extreme wide lens at 10 feet away with the Panasonic FZ1000. And let's think about that for a minute. What kind of shot is this? The long shot. What is the long shot telling our audience? It's giving the audience kind of specific information. In terms of story now, what are we telling the audience in a wide shot?
An establishing shot.
Yeah, it's probably an establishing shot. And what does an establishing shot tell the audience?
The location of where the person is.
Yeah, where is this taking place? Yeah, it involves boy number 2, and boy number 2 is set. He said he's going to go meet his buddy at the park, right? So the scene opens and we have our establishing shot and we can see boy number 2 at the park, right? So does it make sense to you that this establishing shot probably wouldn't have a really out of focus background, would it? Because if the background was really out of focus, then some of the details that the audience needs to think about when they think about exterior park day would be, leaves and bushes and trees and, information that in a wide shot is acceptable, because in a wide shot, we're not trying to get too much explanation. We just want to know, where are we? What's happening? What's happening comes in narrower focal lengths. Where we are, time of day, location, who's involved, all of that can be determined by our establishing shot, right? But the minute we want to talk about some dialogue, maybe we might want to get closer to the subject in a medium shot so we can start learning more about why he's in the park, and then what does he say to his buddy when his buddy shows up, right? So intimate dialogue is this kind of framing, what we've got here. It's still, notice I didn't change anything up top. All I'm doing is playing with the subject to camera distance right now. The focal length is still 25 millimeters. The f-stop is all the way open at a 3.2, right? The background is gently out of focus, but on a wide angle lens at only 2.5 feet from my subject, if you look down here at the diagram, I can get it to look like this. Nice, right? 2-button close up, important dialogue, right? Less important dialogue happens in your medium shot, which is out here at 5 feet away. Specific action, less important dialogue, introduction of a second character into the scene, maybe in a 2-shot, all of that kind of stuff's going to happen out here at a medium framing. Okay. Medium framing cuts at the belt buckle and shows us the actor from the belt buckle to probably the top of the head with a little bit of headroom. You see how there's not much headroom there? We'd call that 2 fingers, right? You see how I got 2 fingers above my head in my little computer camera, right? 2 fingers headroom, crop it at the belt buckle, and that's a standard medium shot. Okay. Less important dialogue, supplementary action, continuation of the action we saw in the wide shot. So maybe he's walking down the path here, looking, scanning the environment for his buddy who's going to show up on a bike, maybe. So we want to see that action in a wider lens so we understand what's happening in the scene. But as soon as he spots his buddy, we might come in on a medium lens. Hey, Joe, what's up? And then the reverse shot will be Joe pulling up into the same framing on his bike. Hey, Lou, how's life? Right? This framing. And then Lou will say, man, life's a bummer right now. I got problems. I need to borrow some money. That's important dialogue, and we need to see that in this framing. In this framing, we probably want the tree to be nice and softly out of focus, because if it's not, the audience might start thinking about, oh, look, it's the fall and the leaves are starting to change colors. That's really pretty. I used to live in Connecticut and I remember when that happened. It usually happened around, and all of a sudden the audience is off on some kind of tangent thought thread that has nothing to do with the fact that Lou is hitting up his buddy for, to borrow a C note, right? I need to borrow $100, that's in here in this close-up. And so we want to blur that background so it doesn't compete with Lou in the foreground delivering critical dialogue, right? So we definitely want this blurry background in a close-up. We might want it to be softly out of focus in the medium shot. Not so important out here in the long shot. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about depth of field as well, because you want to be thinking about the framing too. In a framing solution like an establishing shot, it's better to have a lot of detail so the audience knows exactly where we are, exactly what time of day, and exactly who's involved in this scene, right? Okay.
What would justify something being hard out of focus? Is there a stylistic choice that would merit that?
Hard out of focus?
Just going off the premise of something being soft out of focus. What
Like really soft out of focus?
Well, like if you were to have a really tight depth of field on your subject and have everything behind them be extremely out of focus, what would merit that?
Okay, let me change some of your terminology.
Okay.
Tight, let's exchange the word tight for deep or shallow.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
You
Gotcha.
remember the illustration from the magazine article? Where's my magazine article? Right? Shallow depth of focus means only a little bit of the foreground and a little bit of the background are going to be included in this zone of focus, right? Deep depth of field means a lot of foreground and a lot of background extending deep into the frame is going to be in sharp focus inside the zone of focus. So reserve the word tight for a lens with a very narrow field of view. We call that a tight frame, right? So let's save the word tight for lens discussions and deep or shallow for depth of field discussions. Does that make sense?
Definitely, like keep it to framing and, like you said, lenses as well, like a visual.
That's going to help you keep the concepts clear in your own mind, but it's even more important than that. It's going to help you clarify your point to somebody you're discussing this with on set. Like if you're the director and you're talking to your DP, you don't want to say, I want to use tight depth of field on this shot. The DP will be like, what? You mean you want to use a tight lens to get shallow depth of field? Oh, okay. Tight means lens, deep or shallow means depth of field. Narrow lenses with tight framing and magnification offer an opportunity for shallower depth of field. Remember we were on a 75 mil lens and what happened to our subject? Let's go back to the 75 mil at 10 feet away. Here's your narrow field of view that you get on a telephoto lens. Here's that tight framing, right? Can get even tighter. Let's go to an 85, right? Here's an 85, which is a more common focal length. The Rokinons, we have 85s. We don't have 75s. This is what we call tight framing. It's a tight close-up, right? 2-button close-up. And it's got 1 or 2 fingers of headroom, right? So here's your tight close-up. Here's your shallow depth of field. Make sense?
And shallower in this case would be harder.
Let's say softer, gently out of focus, or harder in focus. The more the subject becomes in focus, the harder the contrast becomes. So that's where the term harder has context in this conversation. It's talking about the contrast, how the contrast increases on the background as the focus becomes sharper. So the contrast becomes harder as the focus becomes sharper in a tighter frame on a longer lens. That's kind of the nomenclature I want you to use when you're thinking about this situation. If we go to a wider aperture or a brighter aperture, we can soften the detail in the background, soften the contrast in the background on this tight framing. If we go to wider framing with a shorter lens, longer and shorter, shorter and longer, a shorter lens, let's say we'll go to a 50 millimeter, we have medium framing, more contrast in the background. The background is slightly sharper on looser framing on a medium shot on a standard lens, 50 millimeter at f4 at a distance of 10 feet. That's kind of how the vocabulary works here. And as long as we keep that the same, no matter who you're talking to on any movie set. We're going to think about the same things when we hear the same definitions or words, right? Softer contrast, harder contrast. Softer focus, yeah, you could use the term softer in reference to degrees of in or out of focus, but very rarely you'll hear somebody say harder focus. You'll hear softer focus, or sharper focus. The opposite of sharper is duller, but we don't say dull focus because that's kind of too nebulous, right? Soft or sharp, hard contrast or soft contrast, wide frame, tight frame, long shot, extreme long shot, medium shot, close-up shot. Okay, this is the vocabulary now that you're going to want to embrace. Okay, so here's your 50 millimeter lens at 10 feet away. Here's your 35 millimeter lens at 10 feet away. And here's your 85 millimeter lens at 10 feet away. Do you see how we can make the statement that wide angle lenses apparently show us sharper detail, and telephoto lenses from the same distance show us more separation, more softer backgrounds, more, what's the other word we can use to describe what's happening back here? Do you remember the word?
Okay.
Bokeh, right? This is bokeh back here, the quality of out of focusness, right? In some lenses, you can see little kind of circles developing right on a really long lens. If we switch to, let's look at our background, see if we got one that's, I was hoping for one at night, but I don't think we have a night scene here. Not really. Well, on a really long lens at the church, you can kind of see the further away our subject gets. You see how that background is sharper, and then as the subject to camera distance increases or decreases, you see the detail in the background starting to get really sort of blobby and soft. This is bokeh back here, right? This is 8 feet away on 115. Let's go to 135. There's 135. That's the longest Rokinon we have. I'm going to put my subject back out at about 10 feet. You can refer to the bokeh as a quality of out of focusness of your background. And then if it's point sources, little highlights like twinkly lights or something, they're going to be round circles. Anybody remember what this framing is called?
Close up.
What kind of close up? What kind of close up?
Can you call it the talking head, or is that something else?
No. The talking head is a phrase we use to describe, well, it's a term we use to describe the overall scene design. Is it a lot of close-ups with people just talking back and forth, shot, reverse shot? We call that a talking heads piece, right? It's all close-ups and not a lot of wide shots, not a lot of variety in terms of framing. All right, we'll call that a talking heads shot or a talking heads piece. But the actual framing, the actual term to describe this frame is what? It's a type of close-up, that's true. Do you remember which type of close-up?
Extreme close up.
Not quite.
It looks like
Pardon?
Medium?
No, I already told you. I already showed you a medium shot. What's the medium shot? Where do we crop a medium shot on this boy?
The shoulders?
Shoulders? You're not paying attention.
The waist.
The medium shot is way out here at the belt buckle. Remember? The belt buckle and 2 fingers of headroom, 2 or 3 fingers of headroom. This is a medium frame. So this frame is what? It's a type of close-up. You had it in your shooting assignment.
I was going to say a haircut, but
Well, we call this a haircut. You see the top of frame is trimming inside of what would be his natural profile. There's some hair missing from this framing, right? We call this a haircut right here. All right. The fact that we're cropping the bottom of the frame at the Adam's apple, okay, this framing is called a big close-up. So we have a standard close-up or a loose close-up, which is out here, right? 2-button close-up, 2 buttons, and the hair is at the top of the frame, right? That's a standard close-up. A loose close-up might be another button on the shirt out here, right? We crop it at the pectoral muscles or the breasts, right? And this is a loose close-up. And then a big close-up, we're cropping it at the Adam's apple and giving them a haircut, right? Cropped at the Adam's apple, giving them a haircut. This is a big close-up. The head, the face is big in frame, big close-up. If we wanted to see an extreme close-up, we'd be way in here, inside the bridge of the nose, just the eyes, right? That's your extreme close-up. Okay. We're going to talk more about framing specifically later in the semester, which is next week, and in cinematography too. Okay. Because the frames that we choose help us create the different pieces that the editor uses to piece together a scene and have it make sense and flow nicely for the audience, right? But I don't hold you responsible for too much of that in cinematography 1. I just want you to know the difference between, you know, a standard close-up, let's say, which is out here, you know, maybe a big close-up, and then understand an extreme close-up is in on the eyes, okay, in here. We also call a big close-up a choker. Anybody want to venture to guess why?
It's around the neck, so it's like choking the subject.
The bottom of the frame is right around the neck.
Oh.
The Adam's apple, right, on a guy. So if the bottom of the frame is cutting somebody in the neck, we call that a choker. It's a nickname for a big close-up, okay? So if you guys go to this app and start playing with all these conditions, right? See what happens when you move the subject in and out and don't change the lens or the f-stop, and then start playing with the lens. You know, push the lens out to, you know, 50 and then increase your depth of field. Here's at an 11. Look how sharp the background is compared to our guy standing, and this is an ELS. This is an extreme long shot, right? Because you got a ton of headroom here, and we see him head to toe. This is an ELS, extreme long shot, and it gets better, right? The further back he goes, the more of an extreme long shot it is, to the point where it's, you know, it's truly an establishing shot. You know, the scene might open with the guy walking down the sidewalk and going into the church, right? So we don't need to see him in a close-up doing that. We'll see him maybe in this kind of framing. So we know he's going into a church. We know what the church kind of looks like. Maybe we recognize it, which gives us more context in terms of his location. But beyond that, we don't need to see this much in the frame anymore. And we don't need to have as much of the frame in focus anymore, because we've made this point for the audience. Boy walks into church, right? He's going to go light a candle for his mom on Mother's Day, right? Whatever. Okay. But play with all these different features of the app, because it can help you understand these concepts. The only thing, once again, the only thing it's not doing is it's not showing you the detrimental effects of exposure when you change some of these variables. You have to remember that when you change the f-stop, yeah, your depth of field's going to change, but your exposure is also going to change unless you do something else to the image. And the easiest solution you have to keeping everything in balance is your variable neutral density filter. Okay. I think that this makes it really easy to manage exposure with any camera at this point, because you can lock everything in and then just play with your aperture to affect your depth of field, and then compensate for the liability with the filter. And nothing else has to change on the camera. So you can lock in your frame rate for recording dialogue. You can lock in your ISO based on the recommended native ISO by the manufacturer. That's two of the big three: ISO, frame rate, and f-stop. Well, here's f-stop. So this keeps your exposure triangle organized nicely and helps you compensate for changes in your aperture, which become compositional choices, aesthetic choices. Do I want to see a lot of the carving in focus above the doorway of the church when I shoot his close-up, or do I want it to be nice and softly out of focus so the audience's attention isn't drawn to the background? We stay on him for his dialogue. It's up to you at that point. This becomes, an aesthetic choice that you might make. Yeah, I think it's okay to let a little bit of that into the shot. And sometimes I don't want it to be in the shot. So when we did Angels and Demons, for instance, everybody knows now that we can shoot green screen and we can use plates and we can simulate Tom Hanks being at the Vatican, and we can do that on stage in Hollywood, right? Sometimes in a movie like that, we might avoid too much shallow depth of field because it might tell the audience, oh, they didn't really go to the Vatican. They shot it in Hollywood on the soundstage against green screen. We might include a little bit of depth of field in a shot like this so that the audience does see a little bit more of the detail than they would see maybe in a green screen shot, and, help to sell the idea that, yeah, they really went to Rome for this close-up, right? They really went to the Vatican for some of this stuff. And of course they did. I didn't go. I stayed in LA and lit sets at Sony, but yes, they did actually go to Rome and shoot some of these close-ups.
Right. I actually had a question about that. So traditionally you have your on-set shooting, right? Go to the Vatican to shoot the Vatican, obviously. Or, with the rise of CGI, you can simulate a lot of environments. And then I know recently the Mandalorian series started using a sort of combination of studio shooting, but enhancing it with this projection like mapping. So they built a whole CGI set that's photoreal, but they also put props in the mid-ground so that it would feel more real. And so, yeah, so I'm just wondering how that might affect your uses, some uses of your focus, your depth of field, because obviously you still want to focus on your subject, but how does that relate to the background being simulated like that?
Okay, so now this is how deep the rabbit hole goes. So now, right, this used to be, depth of field used to be the exclusive domain of the cinematographer in camera at the moment the images were created, right? But now, in this day and age, where maybe we can't afford to go to the Vatican anymore, or, the Mandalorian, these scenes are taking place on Tatooine. Where's Tatooine? I don't know. It's 100 light years away in another galaxy. We can't go there as a location. That's not practical. But we can simulate the planet Tatooine if we go to Tunisia and shoot the desert backdrops as plates, right? Now, imagine the plate as something we have. These are plates in this software. So let's go to the mountains. All right, let's pretend that this is Tatooine, right? So we're going to go to, we're going to send a small camera crew to Tunisia, and we're going to shoot nothing but backgrounds of Tatooine, nothing but landscape shots of Tunisia, mountains, desert, sand dunes, whatever, rocks, cliffs, right? Then we're going to save those files and we're going to use them in post-production, right? So now we can build a set on a soundstage, put up a big green screen, or in the case of the Mandalorian, they use an LED digital, basically projection screen, and it's a cyclorama, a true cyclorama, and they'll project the backgrounds onto it just like you would a movie screen. And then they'll shoot the projection images of the real action in the foreground, Mandy in his costume, and they'll combine the projected background into the frame as well. Now, what if the frame looks like this? So we have our plate. The plate is nice and sharp, right? because we shot it with the right settings to see a lot of detail. But in post, we have the flexibility. If it's just green screen, we can throw this background out of focus if we want to. We don't have to use the plate as a sharp plate. It exists as a sharp plate, but with software, we can reduce the resolution. We can shift it out of focus in post-production. And then if we want to shoot Mandalorian's close-up on an 85, we can do that, and we can do what we call buzz in the background in post. We can throw it out of focus in post. You can do this a little bit in Premiere. They've got a blurring tool or a smearing tool, and you can create shallow depth of field in Premiere by just kind of like you would in Photoshop. Select the tool and just rub it over the background that you want to be out of focus, and it'll start blurring it out, right? You can do it in Photoshop as well, and you can do it that way. But you got a plate that starts sharp, and in post-production, you reduce the focus in post. And then you can get this nice look even against a green screen, right? But I'm trying to teach you all how to do it in camera, so that if you're at a coffee shop and you're on a low budget film, you don't have money to be doing green screens on stage and shooting plates and assembling it later with editors and colorists and special effects supervisors. I mean, that's expensive work, right? If you just want soft depth of field, I want you to know how to do it in camera at the moment of creation, so that you can still get pleasing results that you're after without deferring all that to post-production later and spending more money than you have available in your budget, when you could just do it in camera, right? By picking the right lens, using the right f-stop, controlling that with your neutral density fader filter, doing it in camera, okay? If you're able to control it like that at that level, that's what defines you as a cinematographer. Somebody who is in control of all of those facets of the image can mix and match combinations of factors to get predetermined results, do it on a regular basis, and do it on command at the behest of the director, right? That's what our cinematographer is doing, okay? I invite you to play with this software and get used to these controls and what's happening. I've been pushing and pulling the icons at the bottom of the screen. You can change the distance here with this fader as well, okay? Everything can be changed. We can even change the camera. So right now I've been showing you how life works with the Lumix FC1000, right? But let's say you want to check out the Canon 5D, because does that have a bigger sensor or a smaller sensor than the FZ1000? What sensor was in the FZ1000? Do you remember what I put into the menu when I clicked sensor?
1 inch.
It's a 1 inch sensor, right? There it is on this camera. But what size sensor is in the 5D Mark II? Do you remember the dimensions?
I want to say that's a 24 by 36.
24
Probably
by
wrong there.
36,
Okay.
24 by 36. That's a bigger sensor than what's in the FZ1000 then, isn't it? Yeah, it's bigger. It's 1 inch versus 2.5 inches wide. It's bigger. Okay. So remember I told you that sensor size can affect depth of field as well. So let's go to a 50 millimeter lens. Let's go 8 feet from the camera. So we'll go to a loose close-up. Let's go to an aperture of 4. And let's change from a Panasonic FZ1000 to a Canon 5D Mark II and see what happens to the background and the depth of field. All right. So I got to go into these menus and I've got to change Panasonic to Canon. And I've got to change FZ1000 to EOS 5D Mark II. Bam. Uh-oh. Wow. Look at that. Look what happened to the image. What happened to the image? What was it before? What was the framing?
It was a loose close up, and now it's a long shot.
Now it's a long shot, yeah. The sensor size not only is affecting the depth of field, it also affected our field of view, didn't it? So on the 5D Mark II, now we have to think about lenses in a different way. You notice something happened down here as well when we switched over to 5D Mark II. Look at the f-stop scale now. What do you see?
There's a much greater range now.
There's a much greater range because the 50 millimeter lens, if you use the 50 millimeter prime lens from Canon, or in case the Rokinon here, you have way more aperture choices on a 50 millimeter prime lens, and you can go all the way down to f1.4, t1.5, which means wider apertures mean what? Brighter apertures mean what?
I want to say softer focus, but
Softer focus, exactly. Good, Zach. Softer focus. So now we have a wider field of view because the sensor got bigger. The same 50 millimeter lens on the FZ1000 with a smaller sensor felt like a telephoto lens. But on a full size 24 by 36 millimeter sensor, where the sensor is utilizing more of the image circle projected by the lens, it appears to be a wider lens on the Canon 5D. It's the same lens, but on two different cameras with two different size sensors, it has a wider field of view feel to it or a narrow field of view feel. Narrow field of view apparently shows us more focus separation between the foreground and the background. Wider lens apparently draws the background more into focus, but pushes it further away. So the background looks further away on the 5D Mark II, but it looks a little sharper. So if we want to get that background softer on the 5D Mark II, we should really change a couple of things. The first thing we should change is the field of view. We should probably make it narrower because this is an establishing shot again. It's not quite as wide as the church, but it's still a long shot head to toe. And that's, you know, that demands a certain amount of clarity from the foreground to the background just because of the style of shot. But if we want to change our relative position now, let's go into, this is a medium long shot, or what we call a cowboy shot. Anybody know why we call this a cowboy shot?
Because in the
Because,
Western, the cowboy
is it-
always stands there.
In the
He's
old
big, he's
Western,
heroic.
in the old
So you can see
Western,
the guns?
yeah, in the old Westerns, the gun belt hung about right here. So when you cropped the frame at the gun in the holster and you included the head or the hat in the top of the shot, this was referred to as a cowboy frame, right? Cropped at the gun. All right. Which is different from a standard medium, which is cropped at the belt buckle right here, right? So a medium shot, traditional medium shots here, but if you're shooting a Western and you're shooting the gunfight and you get the hand in the foreground you want to see, you can't see it on the medium framing. You got to loosen up. You got to loosen up to something like that. And then you can see the gun hovering over the gun belt waiting to draw the pistol out of the holster, right? That's all it is. So this was called a cowboy. So if the director says, let's shoot that next shot on a medium and you frame this, and he goes, you know, let's go a little looser. Let's go a little looser. Show me a cowboy. You're going to widen out your lens, or you're going to back up on the dolly. If you're wearing a prime lens and you can't zoom, you're going to back up on the tripod or back up on the dolly and you're going to widen out to here. Okay. So, all right, let's stay in now let's go back into the medium. Let's go to a standard medium. So here we are. Here's our f-stop. It was a 4 when we were telling the software we were on the Panasonic camera. It's still at a 4. We're still on a 50 millimeter lens. The background is gently out of focus. This isn't bad. I would use this for a day exterior medium shot. We still know that boy number 2 is somewhere out in the mountains in Montana and it's day exterior. And, you know, we're going to hear a little bit about what he's doing out there, but not all the critical dialogue. Well, what's happening, boy number 2? Well, now I'm out in Montana. I'm on the range and I've got a problem. Really? What's the problem? The problem is we go from a 50 to an 85. One of my horses ran away and I got to go find him. We want to know that in a close-up. And for that, we don't want to think about the mountains in the background anymore. We want them to be nicely out of focus. Well, on an 85, even at an f4, the background is nicely out of focus, right? To get that mountain back sharp again on an 85, we got to go to something like an 11. And now it's going to look similar to what it looked like on the 50, right? We can get it even sharper if we go to a 16 or a 22. But do we want this much competitive detail in the frame when we're hearing about how his prized stallion just ran away? No, we want to see that here, think about it here. And we've already seen this. We've already seen the mountains. We saw it in the wide establishing shot and we saw it in the medium shot. We don't need to keep seeing the mountains. We don't need to think about that anymore, right? So we're going to stay at R4 and let it get nice and blurry. We can even go to a 2.8 maybe and make it nice, or a 2 and make it even nicer out of focus. Look at that. But now it starts feeling a little bit unreal. Now it starts feeling a little fake, you know? So a little bit of sharpness is nice, but too much sharpness might be a problem unless you want to be way in here. Then it can be kind of nice because now there's no ambiguity. We need to be hearing what this guy is saying in this choker, big close-up, right? That horse is worth $2,000 in 1886 value, right? That's important. Longer lens again, right? I'm in Montana, my horse ran away, and it was worth a lot of money. Do you see that? And in each time too, we're letting that background get more and more out of focus. So play with it, right? Play with the f-stop, see what happens to your background. Play with the focal length, see what happens to your focus in the foreground and background, okay?
Professor, what is this app called again?
This is called Depth of Field Simulator. And that's
Okay.
the logo. That's what it looks like. And it's at Depth of Field, dofsimulator.net. And all those links are also in web courses, okay? So I would play with this. You know, the nice thing about this is, like, you know, at my house, it rained all day yesterday. So you can't go outside and set this up with your camera because you don't want your camera to get wet. But you can play with this all day long inside, sitting on a nice comfy sofa with a drink and play around with it until you get really comfortable with the concepts and you start to understand the relationship of lenses and focus distance and depth of field, right? The zone of focus around your focus plane. The focus plane happens right at the subject, right? As it shifts, this is what this red line is. It's the focus plane, right? So as I move the subject back within the frame, you see as well, here's another neat thing about this app. So forget about all of this up here and just look at this relationship right here. You see the gray shaded value? Let me go to a 5.6. You see the gray shaded value on either side of the icon of the girl down here, which represents whatever subject you choose here. Watch how that gray shaded value changes as the subject gets further from the camera. Look at the depth of field increasing. You see that? So the app is going to teach you that depth of field is also the product of camera to subject distance. If the background is way over here, the more distance increases in the foreground, the further the depth of field reaches backwards towards the background. You see that? So play with that and see, look at that. In order to get the background, you see this little infinity mark down here at the bottom? We got a footage scale here. In this universe where the camera is at 0 feet and the subject is moving forward and backwards in the frame, this is 20 feet, 30 feet, 40, 50 feet. At 50 feet, not even, at 40 feet, when the subject is standing at 40 feet, all of that background behind the subject all the way out to infinity on the lens, the infinity focus point on the lens, is sharp. And look at the image. The background is super sharp. It's as sharp as it's going to get. And you also have quite a bit of stuff in the foreground that could be in sharp focus as well, as close as 23 feet from the camera. You see that? So you could have a few things in front of the subject, other horses, cattle, other, part of the posse, also in the frame, also in sharp focus if you push everything away like that. But then you're into this extreme long shot situation. So you may or may not want that. But see how your depth of field changes as you move these things around. See it get really, really narrow until it's just in front of and just behind your subject. And then if you look up here on a 50 millimeter lens on a Canon 5D, yeah, it's kind of a wide frame. But if we go to the 85 we were talking about before, now you can really see how the background is going out of focus. And it's reflected over here. The gray shaded area is very narrow and it's just barely covering the subject icon down here at the bottom. Right? Use it as a visual tool. The numbers tell the story up here, but the visual here and the visual here really drives the point home. I think this is a nice app. I like it. I wish I had it when I was 14 years old. I would have mastered depth of field a lot sooner than I did as it is, but it's great. It's nice. It's helping you wrap your head around all these concepts, and you can think about all the controls at once by looking here, or you can think about just distance here, just f-stops here, just sensor size here, right? And then just change one thing at a time and watch the world, the virtual world change here. I like it. I think it's a cool tool, and I think you guys will like it too if you get used to using it. Okay, let me go back to a lot of what I've been talking about inside the app. I also address here in my presentation. So this is a very simple graphic talking about, the focus distance or the focus plane, the camera to subject distance. All those phrases are referring to this right here, right? On wider lenses, more of this is in focus than on narrower lenses. Okay. Talked about your variable ND filter to help you sort out the business of balancing your exposure. Here's a quick video I shot at the astronaut memorial and at the beach a few months ago. And all I'm doing is I'm keeping the same frame here, and I'm just going to turn the ND filter so you can see how it affects the exposure. So I'm starting on a really overexposed frame as if I didn't have the filter in at all. And then I just start dialing it down until I get the right density in the sky, the right definition on the clouds, the right kind of shadow density, right? So there's some parts of the image that really should have some shadow quality about them, but we still want to see detail in all of these panels on the, and then I turn it all the way closed and you almost get a fade to black effect. All I'm doing is rotating the filter. Everything else stayed the same. You can see I'm at a fairly small aperture because the background is fairly sharp, and I'm on a wide lens too. So a combination of a small aperture and a wide frame or wide field of view is giving me foreground sharpness and background sharpness at the same time. If I don't want to mess with that, and all I want to do is make the image darker, I'm just going to play with the ND filter. I'm just going to turn it. Oops. Uh-oh. I'm just going to turn it. So it's a good tool. It's a very good tool. The variable ND filters haven't been out for very long. They've only been out for maybe, I don't know, 3 to 5 years at the most, I think. The other alternative is single neutral density filters for each effect. So 1-stop ND filter, 2-stop ND filter, 3-stop ND filter. Those are the cut glass style or the Koken style, right? The cut resin style. And it's, one effect per filter. So you change them in and out based on how many f-stops you need. So the variable ND filter is a nice solution, but it's only available, again, it's only available in your round filter styles at this point. So maybe in a couple more years, we'll have variable NDs in square cut glass. It would be nice. We can do that with polarizers, but we haven't done it yet with ND. So stay tuned for that from the manufacturers. So that's depth of field as it relates to exposure and the ways in which we can manipulate depth of field accordingly. Have I lost anybody with this conversation today? Is anybody just totally confused at this point? I mean, it's okay because, you know, we've got plenty of time to talk about it. We can also, you know, we can also go to, you know, private Zoom meetings if that would help. Have I lost anybody with this conversation? I hope not. I hope that I try to repeat myself, say it a couple of different ways, and one of those ways hopefully will resonate with you as we discuss this. That's why at certain points it might sound like I'm repeating myself, because I am. The more you hear this and think about this and talk about this, the more you play with that simulator app, I think the easier it will be for you to wrap your head around these concepts. But all of the stuff we talked about today is really, really hard to practice with this tool, okay? Because the lens in your cell phone is, traditionally speaking, unless you got one of those new Samsung whiz-bang phones with several lenses on the back, mine's got one lens, and it's a wide angle lens, which means a very wide field of view, which is inherently very sharp from foreground to background. This camera phone will opt for deep depth of field 9.5 times out of 10, right? But even with a wide angle, I can throw the background out of focus. Do you remember how? Even with this camera, I can get shallow depth of focus with a wide angle lens. How would I do it?
Don't you have to download like specific apps that like can calibrate the aperture and ISO and stuff like that?
That's cheating. Assume I don't have the app. How would I do it? There's one aspect of depth of field, one way to control depth of field that doesn't require an app and doesn't require that you change lenses, but it can give you a soft background. What do I do with the camera? Where do I put it?
You put it closer,
Move it
closer to the subject.
Move it really close to the subject. The closer you get to the subject with your lens, with your wide lens, the more likely your background will be out of focus, because the difference between the two measurements will be very great. The ratio will be very great. So if I'm only a foot away from my subject on a wide angle lens on a cell phone, and the background's 50 feet away across the street, right? That background is probably going to be softly out of focus, even though I'm on a wide angle lens, because the camera to subject distance is only 1 foot and the background is 50 times further away. Does that make sense? Practice in the app. Don't take my word for it. The app will show you the same relationship. Check it out. Move my, do you guys see these tiles, or is that just me? That's just me, right? I'm going to put that over here. Look, here's my, let's go to a wide angle lens. Let's go to here. Let's do this. Let's see if I can go to a cell phone. Let's see if we've got a cell phone in here. I don't have a cell phone. I'm going to go to the smallest sensor I can find. Maybe to do that, we'll go up here to sensor size and see what the smallest sensor is. Yeah.
The Samsung Galaxy is.
Yep. Samsung Galaxy has a 1/3 inch chip in it, I believe. Let's go to 1/4 inch chip, or 1/6 of an inch. Okay. A 20 millimeter lens on that sensor looks like a telephoto. we got to be really wide on your cell phone. And we are, these cell phone lenses are extremely wide. So here is an 8mm lens, or 7.6, that's fairly common, on your cell phone. Here's our boy number 2 in the frame, right? At, what are we, 25 feet away. But if we come closer, let's move the subject to 10 feet away like we've been doing before. At 10 feet away, the background is still really sharp, isn't it? Because the sensor is really, really small in your cell phone and the lens is really wide. In order to get that background out of focus on your cell phone, I got to move this subject way up here. And then and only then do I have a shot at getting that background out of focus. And it's still pretty readable, you know, but I'm only 2 feet away, right? So the problem with the cell phone is it's too wide and the sensor's too small to give you the same soft, gentle bokeh that you could get from a Canon 5D or even from the FZ1000. We got it with the FZ1000 with a 1-inch sensor, just by putting a long telephoto lens on the camera and getting close enough to the subject, right? So the cell phone, that's what makes the cell phone a really bad choice for shooting your projects, because you're robbed of half of the creative choices you get with better cameras. Do you understand that now? So this isn't the best tool for a filmmaker if you have other options. If you don't have any other options, if this is the only camera you've got and you're on a desert island and you got to shoot a movie, well, then it is what it is, right? And then you take all of the benefits from this tool and maximize the drawbacks of this tool, and you do the best you can with this camera phone. But if you got a choice between, if you're on a desert island and you got a choice between shooting a movie on a cell phone and shooting a movie on an Ursa Mini, if you want the most control creatively over your images, I'm sincerely hoping that this is the one you choose, because this tool gives you far more ability to create and play with your images than this one does. But if you don't have that and all you got's this, then you got to do what you got to do. Okay. Understand the limits of the cell phone and try to use them, treat them as an advantage, you know, by composing your shots in a way that maximizes everything the phone can do and minimizes its drawbacks, right? That's pretty much it, I think. I give you a little glossary at the end of this. Some of the terms that I've been using, you can, you know, refresh your memory. Angle of view, aperture, background, foreground, composition, depth of field, diaphragm, exposure, so forth. Focal distance, focus, f-stop. Okay. So this will help you. I also give you a glossary in your startup menu in modules over on web courses. It's up here in section 0 point something, I guess. Where is it? Resources, glossary. Okay, if we open up glossary, let's take a look. So you got a PDF, you can download it, open it up, and it's several pages long. So 174 pages, A to Z, okay? If you hear a term, if I throw a word out during a lecture and you don't get it, it's gonna take a while to load. You don't understand, go ahead and download this glossary, download it as a PDF and keep it on your computer. Then it won't take so long to load, but here it is, A to Z, right? Ambient light, albedo, ampacity, angle of view, Apple box, answer print. You know, this is a really great glossary, and it's written by the same author that wrote your camera assistant's handbook, Dave Elkins. Okay. So that's in your startup menu. So what else can I say? That's about it, really. What are your questions at this point? Is anything unclear? Have I raised questions in your mind about some of these issues? Talk to me. What do we got? What's going on? Did I totally muddy the water for you today or what?
No. You're good. So what is your like ideal like lens choice to camera choice, like the combination?
Way back a million years ago when I was a teenager and I was learning 35mm photography for the first time, the old timers used to say, master photography with a 50mm lens and everything else becomes very clear and simple to understand. The 50mm lens, if you take your hands and you cup your eyes, like do the binocular thing and look, the angle of view that you can see with your normal eye without any of your sort of peripheral vision, just what's in front of you, that's basically 50mm, right? That's what a 50mm lens is going to show you on an Ursa Mini, let's say, or on a Canon 5D. So understand that with a 50mm lens, if you get closer to your subject, that's like putting in a stronger lens on the camera and not moving the camera at all. Just physically move the camera closer on the same 50mm and your field of view will change. Your relationship to the subject will change, and learn how to use that 50mm perspective back way out and you get a wide angle lens, right? We used to say to, people that were learning for the first time, they'll say, how many, do I need a bunch of lenses? No, you just need a 50mm. If you need something wider, move closer to your subject. If you need something tighter, move closer to your subject. If you need something wider, back away. 50mm lens. And then, whatever camera you choose at that point is really kind of up to you. It has to do, I think, more with ergonomics anymore. In the old days, though, some cameras were made to be fully manual with no automated help whatsoever, no processor, no computer internally. That was the camera that I started with, right? The Olympus. The Olympus, Olympus OM1, right? This camera, if you don't know how to use it, if you don't know how to set it, it's not going to help you. There's no automated control over the exposure in this camera. You have to set your f-stops. You have to set your shutter speeds, right? Manual operation only. And then cameras, as the years went on, the cameras became easier to use, the consumer cameras, because we had cameras coming out that had automatic exposure control and everything. And then it was really a question of, do you like a big camera or a small camera? Do you have big hands or small hands? Do you want, some manufacturers had a huge variety of accessories and other manufacturers had very little in terms of accessories. So your choices became less about controlling the camera itself and more about the system you were buying into, right? And nowadays it's kind of the same thing. So almost any camera you want to start with is going to put you on an equal par. The sensor sizes will be slightly different. Like today, if you wanted to compare, say the Z camera E2 M4, all right. Wonderful camera. It has a micro four thirds size sensor in it, like the GH5, right? Small sensor. It's going to offer some problems achieving shallow depth of field, and you'll have to know a lot about lenses and a lot subject camera distances and all that so that you can work through the problems of a smaller sensor and get the same visual effects out of the M4 camera. Or you can go to a larger sensor camera like the 5D Mark IV now, I think it's up to, and get the better, easier depth of field solutions with the bigger sensor. Bigger sensor is better in low light. Smaller sensor is sharper overall, right?
That's kind of what I've been struggling with the GH5 was like just getting that low light. And I know they come out with the GH5S like shortly after they came out with the GH5. But the GH5 really struggles with low light. You have to like really adjust settings and play around with it.
And so if the camera's not really good at low light, then what you're going to have to do is learn how to use supplementary lighting, because that's also part and parcel of the craft work of being a cinematographer. Know how to control your camera, know what your media is capable of doing, and know how to light. And if you know how to do all those things, doesn't matter if the camera has a low light sensor or not. If you know how to light, if you know how to add lights to your shot and have it look natural, have it look dramatic, have it be expressive, that's preferable in my book. I never walk into a location or never walk into a set on stage and say, oh, this is what it looks like. Great, let's shoot it. Absolutely not. The script is going to inform me. It's going to tell me what the lighting needs to look like, and I'm going to craft that lighting accordingly. So having a low light sensor for me is, I don't care, you know, because I use lights and I use exposure controls. I operate my camera manually, and the camera works for me. I don't work for it.
Exactly. I remember I've seen a few memes that it makes me chuckle every time. It's like, you know, you have a GH5 when you have 20 plus lights in the same room.
I got news for you. 20 is not a whole lot when you're talking about a major feature film. I mean, there were times when we had hundreds of lights or thousands of lights on set. It all depends on what the set was. What was it supposed to look like, you know? Being worried about that is worrying about whether or not it's you know, it's going to rain tomorrow. It is or it isn't. If it rains or if it doesn't, you still got to work tomorrow, and you got to deal with it, right?
You got to make it happen.
If you need a lot of lights, you need a lot of lights. That's the job. To say I'm going to use one camera over the other so I don't have to use lights is like saying I'm going to go out and paint a watercolor landscape, but I'm only going to do it with one hand. You know, you need two hands to mix paints and carry your easel out into the field and to set up shop. And maybe you can actually do the brush strokes with one hand, but why would you want to approach that problem at a deficit? You know, why would I want to shoot a movie without lights? That's ridiculous. You know, you can make that a creative choice and say, look, I don't want to use any supplementary lighting because my movie is supposed to be taking place in 1650. And they didn't have artificial lighting in 1650. So I'm going to limit my lighting package to open windows and candles and reflector cards. That's fair. Now you're making a lighting choice based on other things that are also important to your story, like the time and place of the script, right? So you have a movie like The Revenant, where they're going to go marching out into the wilderness where there's no power sources and there's, you know, it's really, really hard to get to these locations on foot, let alone with a truck full of equipment. They make some choices. Hey, it's the 1600s in, you know, the Rocky Mountains of Canada. Why am I going to bring an 18,000 watt HMI light that now I need a generator and an extra, you know, big crew to handle all the cabling and everything like that to give myself a lighting effect that's only going to stand out and call attention to itself in a movie about a trapper in the 1600s in British Columbia, right? So they use reflectors instead. They use candles inside. They use open windows, and it gives the film a better sense of reality. But would you try to shoot, you know, any contemporary drama with a lot of, you know, interiors and things like that, and not use lights? No, it would be ludicrous to.
It would be like nearly impossible, right?
It'd be pretty hard, you know, nothing's impossible, but it would be pretty difficult. And at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself whether or not the results of limiting yourself in that way was effective in telling your story. You know, I mean, if it's a modern day drama about a post-apocalyptic world where there's no more electricity because everybody's a zombie, and, you know, you live in an apartment using battery operated camp lights to light your dinner table after the sun goes down, then yeah, now we're talking about specific aspects of your lighting that support your story. But if it's a cop drama or a hospital show, you know, TV show, like, you know, whatever, ER, let's say, you're going to shoot that movie without lights? No. You're going to need lights. You're going to need lights in the set that look like they're really supposed to be there, and you're going to need supplementary lights to help the look. Overhead fluorescents are really kind of ugly on their own, but if you supplement them with a little something extra fill light or an extra little small key light on the floor next to camera maybe or whatever to help the shape of the lighting. You can dress that up, make it look really nice. And so when you're dealing with situations like that, having a camera with a low light sensor is often kind of a moot point.
Right.
But if you're shooting a documentary and you're alone and you can't lug a bunch of equipment with you, and that includes lighting and stuff, and you have to sort of go into a situation and shoot an interview with whatever's there because you're working alone, that's a different argument, right? Then you want an A7S2 or 3, you know, and you might say the GH5 is a nice camera, but when I'm in a dark office on the 30th floor downtown alone shooting an executive environmental portrait and getting an interview of somebody, and all I have is maybe a window with a good, you know, exposure to the sky, I'm going to take what I can get when I'm in there. I want a camera that's going to work well with low light available in a place like that. I'm going to choose a different camera. Right.
And at the end of the day, it's just a tool to be able to tell the story with. So
exactly.
It's like
exactly.
you use what you need to use to make the story come to light better.
Right. Right. You know, you know, it's that's really it. That's the craft work of cinematography is mastering your tools, knowing how to use them, knowing, you know, in any situation you use the right tool for the right job. And you don't get, you know, too hung up on, you know, is it a Canon or a Panasonic? Is it a Red or a Blackmagic? I don't care. You know,
Right.
do I have a device that's workable? Will it give me a good result in a variety of situations with a minimal amount of fussing and messing around to get that camera to produce an acceptable image? As long as it, you know, as long as it's an adequate tool, the best tool, the most effective tool in my box is up here anyway, right? Yep. It's your brain and it's the experience that you gain. You know, this is where it starts, right? So every time you get a shooting assignment in school, you should be playing around and testing things. But man, I can't tell you how many times students turn in homework that represents the least amount of effort, the quickest solution, the least amount of creative thought, right? Because they just want to get it done. And I can get that. You know, I understand you got a lot on your plate, but if you're not testing yourself and pushing the limits of your tools and seeing what they do, you're going to do it one way or the other. You're going to do it here in school where the mistakes don't cost you much, or you're going to do it out in the world where you're working on a job and those mistakes are going to cost you dearly. You're going to get you fired, or they're not going to get you hired back. Right. So every time you have an assignment here at school, you should treat it as an opportunity to get to know your tools better and what tools you have at your disposal. All right.
So I remember when I was doing still photography, when I first started out, there was always that big argument, like Nikon or Canon, Nikon or Canon. And at the end of the day, I was like, who cares? Like, just take the photo.
Yeah. Well, you know, I don't know. I remember feeling that way. I remember when I was, you know, when I was really young, when I was first starting out, I learned on Olympus cameras because that was the camera my father bought. He bought an Olympus camera. So I bought an Olympus camera. And so we were an Olympus family, right? My friend who lived down the street, his dad bought a Ricoh camera. And so they were a Ricoh camera family, you know? And, you know, what difference did it make? Not much. I know early on in my photography career, I had opportunities to use Canon cameras long time ago, 40 years ago. And they always felt kind of boxy and sort of hollow and cheaply mechanical. And I didn't like the way they felt in my hand because the Olympus felt a certain way and the Canon felt very different, just ergonomically. And so I developed a bias. I didn't like Canon cameras for the longest time. And I wouldn't use them. I wouldn't buy them. I didn't even want to think about Canon cameras when it was a film world in the old days and I was a photographer. But as soon as the digital world started creeping into my reality, the first digital camera I bought, Canon was at the forefront of that technology. So my first digital DSLR was a Canon camera. And I remember thinking how ironic, you know, I'm moving into a new paradigm of digital photography, and my choice for camera is one that I never would have picked 10 years prior to that, you know? So it became sort of a superfluous, you know, emotion to say I will never use a Canon camera, because that would have excluded me from the digital technology that was brand new and everybody wanted to try it, you know, and it led me to Photoshop. And from there, it led me to better digital still cameras. And from that, it led me to, you know, digital cinema cameras. So it's an evolution. Everything is an evolution, and every tool that you use, you can think of it's one step along the way, along the journey of learning more and more about cinematography. And then ultimately your job and your world becomes about choices, choosing this one over that one for the benefits of this or the benefits of that. And it's really about the script and what does the script need? And then it doesn't matter if you pick that camera, you're fine with it. If you pick that one, it works a little differently, feels a little differently, but you can use that one too. It's just a tool. And you just swap these things in and out at will to serve your needs. And that's when it becomes really, you know, then it gets really fun, because then it's just a matter of, you know, setting all that up and then going out and creating whatever it is you're trying to create. Don't get locked into brand. I hate it when I hear, you know, I watch these videos on YouTube and I see something as stupid as, what's the best camera in 2021? Oh man, if you're asking that question, man, you're not even in the same room with a cinematographer.
It gets me every time.
You're not,
Like,
you're not even in the
audibly
same
laugh.
room, you know? That's not the question to be asking. What's the best camera for me might be a more fair way of wording that question. But what's the best camera? I don't know. How long is a piece of string, right? It's an arbitrary question. I need a lot more information before I can give you a qualified answer. Where's my location? What's my script all about? How much help do I have? What kind of lenses can we afford to use, rent or buy, right? There's too much information missing from that question to make a reasonable answer, right? The best camera for you is more specific. Then it, you know, it starts taking into account personal preferences, budget. You know, do I have lenses already that I can use? You know, a lot of the reason why the DSLR video cameras became very, very popular is because photographers using Canon cameras had already spent thousands of dollars on lenses. And did they want all that stuff to sit in the closet and collect dust forevermore the minute they stopped shooting stills and shot video? And so the answer was no. So the manufacturers had to figure out a way to make a digital video camera that could use the photographic lenses. And that was a whole leap in technology that we didn't have up until 2005, let's say, right? When we started putting, you know, photographic lenses on video cameras, and we went from a 3-chip video camera to a 1-chip video camera. These were big leaps in technology and evolutions of thought and creativity that had to happen, which is what made the transition from film to digital so slow and deliberate. It wasn't just a choice of going, I guess we'll shoot digital now. You know, the manufacturers had to be on board with new camera designs, and the lens manufacturers had to come on board with ways of adapting their old tools to their new camera bodies, and all of this stuff had to happen. So, you know, you're now on the backside of a big wave that started 15 years ago, and you're riding that wave right now. So there's a lot in the question of cinematography that we have to cover and understand. It makes this conversation over the course of a semester kind of a clumsy one. And some people can feel left behind in the conversation. And that's why the only thing I can tell you is, you know, just try to, you know, pay attention and just sort of let it soak in and then let it marinate, you know, just let it kind of bounce around in there. And eventually the more we talk about it and the more you do assignments and you practice, light bulbs will start going off. And when that happens, it's a good feeling, because it feels like all of the effort you've put into trying to understand this and all of the time you spent on your homework and on your projects and listening to me run at the mouth will start paying dividends. You'll start to understand and you'll go, oh, now I get it now. I get it now. And the minute you get it, that's when you can start your projects will go to the next level. Everything that you work on will go to the next level because you'll be capable of more, right? So that's the objective here. So I want to use that to segue into the exposure worksheet if anybody wants to talk about that. Did anybody have a particularly difficult time with that worksheet?
I was kind of following it for the most part, and then I actually had to go and watch the supplementary video you posted about it to get a full grasp of it, because the frame rate was really throwing me off. How the frame, yeah, because I could figure out what the filters were doing, what the ISO is doing, and all that coming from the baseline, and then I was like, okay, I know the frame rate's changing, so that has to affect something. But I just couldn't figure out, so I had to go watch the video. And then once I watched it, I was like, okay, I still don't like it, but it makes sense, you know?
Don't like it, but it makes sense. Well, that's what I'm after. That's the response I'm after. You might not like it, but it makes sense, and you gotta deal with it. So let's look at the worksheet. I think this is the one I gave you guys. It works the same anyway. It's the same information and stuff. So these gray shaded values, you were supposed to figure out what goes here based on what was changed over here as it related to the original baseline exposure, which was the one at the top. Okay. And then on page 2, I gave you a bunch of, where's my page 2? I don't have it. Uh-oh. Let me see if I can find a copy of this with page 2. Let's see if I got page 2 on this version. Yes, I do. Okay. So, okay, page 2, I gave you all the jump charts, right? So here's your ISO chart as it compares to low ISOs and high ISOs, lower sensitivity, higher sensitivity. Here's your f-stop chart right here, jumping back and forth from wide, bright f-stops to small, dark f-stops. Here's your ND chart that compares the different densities of neutral density filters. And this is not as important. This is a shutter angle chart, but it does kind of talk to you a little bit about, the resulting shutter speed, but it doesn't really address frame rate. Frame rate is pretty one-to-one cut and dry conversation. It's like 24 frames is our normal frame rate with sound. Right? If you want slow motion, do you have to shoot more frames or less frames in a sequence? For slow motion, you have to shoot more frames. So 48 and 96 frames per second are slow motion frame rates. So then what does that make a 12 frames per second frame rate? What do you suppose happens there? If you're shooting less than 24 frames per second, what's happening to the motion in your image? What's happening to the image itself?
Getting blurred.
It might blur a little bit because 12 frames per second means the film is going slower through the camera, or the video is being shot slower, which is going to affect the shutter speed, which is going to affect motion blur. And the image might look like people are kind of running around a little bit because you're shooting fewer frames. So there's more what we call in-betweening. There's more motion happening between each frame than gets recorded by the camera. So there's actually a difference or a parallax between frames, and it makes the action look a little bit kind of like it's fast. You ever see the old timey black and white films of like New York City at the turn of the century on YouTube, and it looks like everybody's running around super fast. Because back then, remember, they were using hand cranked cameras and there was no standard for frame rate. And so they might be cranking the camera at 16 frames a second, and, because they're turning the handle slow. 16 frames a second, when you transfer that to 24p video, everybody looks like they're running around like that. So that's why old movies look like people are running around, because the frame rate was not 24p, right? But if you want to shoot slow motion of superheroes fighting, you're going to shoot probably 96 or, maybe more frames per second, 120 frames a second, to get the slow motion and the good, sharp isolation, no image blur, right? You shoot at a faster shutter speed with 124 frames. So your equivalent shutter speed might be, 2/50th of a second as opposed to 148, 1/48, which is the speed at 24p. So it does have effect on the exposure, and it does have an effect on the resulting image when your frame rate changes. And so I wanted you to kind of think about that a little bit too when you were dealing with this this worksheet. So if the baseline exposure was all of these settings, okay, and you guys know how a baseline works, right? I'm saying to you that the exposure solution in line 1 was an ideal exposure. I don't know what it was. The subject really doesn't matter. What it's a picture of is irrelevant. The only thing that's relevant is for you to know that the picture that I took, whatever it was correctly exposed when these were the settings on the camera, right? So I had some ND filter dialed into the camera, or I had filters attached to the lens, let's say. I had an f-stop of this, I had an ISO of this, a shutter speed of this, and a frame rate of that, right? This becomes my baseline. This, I know these combinations gave me a good exposure. So the exercise becomes, what happens if I change something? How does it result in the other settings? Do the other settings change or stay the same? So you have to evaluate what changed, if anything, by how much rate of change. Was it overexposure making the image brighter, or underexposure making the image darker? Once you understand that relationship between the baseline and the new set of solutions, you can fill in the blanks for what's missing, okay? So the idea was, in the example line, the baseline exposure was this, and then some changes happened on line 2, example, on the example line. We had to fill in the gray box, and the solution was a 5.6. And so you have to look at the other numbers and see, well, what changed? Well, the frame rate stayed the same. The shutter speed stayed the same. The ISO is what changed. The ND filters were the same. So we had to arrive at a value. This was blank, and this changed from 800 to 1600. So if that's the only thing that changed, that is the only factor we had to consider when we were determining what was missing in this gray box, right? So you have to look at ISO 800. This is your baseline, ISO 800. Your new ISO became 1600. For some reason, for whatever reason, I changed from 800 to 1600 on the camera. And when I did that, it meant that f4 was no longer the appropriate aperture. I had to change it to something else. So the answer was a 5.6. But to arrive at the answer, I have to understand how the ISOs work. To do that, you go to the jump chart and you look here, you say, here's where I'm starting, ISO 800. The ISO changed to 1600. So what's the relationship of ISO 800 to 1600? What can you tell me about the difference?
Doubled.
It doubled. So what does that mean?
It got brighter.
Why did it get brighter? The image got brighter, but why did it get brighter?
Because it's more sensitive to light now.
It's more sensitive to light. And the fact that it only doubled or only went one jump to the right, what relationship is that? What do we call that when something goes only one jump in either direction? The rate of change is expressed in f-stops. So how many f-stops is that change?
Should be 1, right?
One jump, one f-stop, right? It's as simple as that. One jump is one f-stop. Because you went to the right towards the sensitive end of the scale, that means that when you went from 800 ISO, one jump to 1600 ISO, you made the image brighter by one f-stop. Okay? So that's an analysis of the rate of change that happened in the example from the baseline to the new set of solutions. If the exposure is one stop brighter and your f-stop originally was a 4, how do you make the image darker with your aperture? What do you do to the aperture?
You close it by a stop.
You close it. right? You close it down to make the image darker. You open it up to make the image brighter. If your rate of change is only one f-stop, then it's obvious that the change from a 4 becomes a 5/6, because when you go to the jump charts for Aperture, if your original f-stop was a 4 and you need to darken it by one f-stop, that means you got to go one jump to the left, which is darker, and go from a 4 to a 5/6. See that? That's how you get to the answer for the example, right? So
is there a precise way to calculate that? Because I was kind of doing like a educated guess with mine.
this is about as precise as it gets without a light meter. The answer to precision is use a light meter, and the light meter tells you exactly what you got to do, because with the light meter, what am I doing? With the light meter, I'm dialing all this information into the light meter, and it's telling me what the new f-stop's going to be. So if I turn this on, okay, in the screen on my light meter, I can tell it how many frames per second. I can tell it what ISO am I at, right? And then it'll tell me at this frames per second and this ISO at this distance from the light I'm using to light myself for these videos. If I push the button and I point the lumisphere at the light, it's going to tell me I need to be at a 4. You see that? It tells me F4 right there in the screen, right? But that's from here, right? What if happens if I get twice as far away from the light source? Well, now, because it's pointing down, not out, and I went almost 3 times as far away, my new aperture is opened way up to a 14.6. You see that? So if my subject was over here trying to use the same light as I'm using to illuminate myself right in front of the computer, the f-stop would have to change, right? So that's what's happening here. But we don't need to really get that complex about this whole situation. Just use your baseline as your data that you're going to compare to your new solution, see what changed, by what rate it changed, and apply that to the value that's missing. So let's go to line 2 and talk about what's going to go here. So what has changed on line 2?
The ISO?
The ISO and the frame rate.
Yeah. So we have the same amount of ND filters attached to the lens. That stayed the same. The shutter speed stayed the same, but the frame rate was reduced to 12 and the ISO was increased to 3200. So let's take these one at a time. So, okay. What's the relationship of 12 frames to 24 frames? Is
So
it
you're
faster
dropping
or slower?
by 50%.
We decreased
Slower
the
frames.
frame rate by 1/2. So that's the same relationship. Half as much or twice as much is still one f-stop. Half as much means, in terms of frames per second, means the image got brighter, right? And twice as many frames means the image is going to get darker. Why? If the shutter's open to accommodate 12 frames a second, X amount of light is passing through the gate and hitting the sensor. If that relationship increases, that means the duration that your shutter is open, allowing light to hit your sensor, is like half the time, right? So you just have to understand the relationship and say 12 frames is 1 stop brighter than 24 frames. Okay, 1 stop brighter. ISO also changed. How many jumps is 32 away from 800? Let's go to page 2. Originally 800, we go 2 jumps to 3200. Is it brighter or darker at 3200? If everything else stays the
Brighter,
same, it's brighter, right? By how many f-stops?
1, since you got one up 1.
How many jumps did I take to get from 800 to 3200?
2.
2 jumps is how many f-stops?
2 f-stops.
2 f-stops. 2 jumps, 2 f-stops. Okay, so in terms of frame rate, I made 1 jump from 24 to 12, and it made it brighter by 1 f-stop. And then I also made the image brighter still by going from 800 to 3200. So if this is 2 stops overexposed and this is 1 stop overexposed, that means that my net overexposure is 3 stops, right? 3 stops of overexposure. So if the image got 3 stops brighter, then what f-stop do I have to change to from a 4 to restore balance to my exposure? Right now, I'm at a deficit of 3 stops overexposed. I need to get the image back down to normal brightness by changing the aperture. What do I got to change it to? If we go to the jump chart, let's find out where we are. We're at a 4. And the image is 3 stops overexposed. So if the image is overexposed, what way do I have to go on the f-stop ring?
Left.
Left,
To the left, right? I got to do what? I've got to
jump 3 times, so wouldn't it be F11?
You gotta close the aperture more.
I'm closing the aperture and I'm moving to the left 3 jumps, right? So let's do it. 1, 2, 3. To the left, 3 jumps, 3 f-stops to the left. And I went from a large F4 to a smaller F11. And that's what goes in this box for line 2. 11. Does that make sense? That's how this worksheet works. So let's look at line 3. Line 3 should be pretty easy because we just did line 2. And we know that 3 stops of overexposure needed an 11 for solution 2. But in solution 3, look at what we got. The frame rate stayed the same as the baseline. The shutter speed stayed the same as the baseline, and so did the ISO. But what changed was the f-stop. It's now an 11, right? Just like it was a minute ago. An 11 is what difference from the original F4 to 11? It's 3 stops. If all this other stuff stayed the same, but we closed the lens down to an 11, what did we do to the image?
It's now underexposed.
It's what?
It's now underexposed.
It's now underexposed by
3 stops.
3 stops, right? Because it was 3 jumps to get from a 4 to an 11 in the last example. Now we're at an 11 and nothing else changed, which means all we did is close the lens down to an 11, which made the image darker. So we have to change our neutral density filters to accommodate an image that's now 3 stops darker than it was for the baseline. So if in the baseline we had 1/16, in other words, we had 4 sets of ND filters stacked on the front of the lens, how much ND do we need now to accommodate this change in f-stop? Well, we can go to our ND filter chart. 1/16. What do we know about 1/16? Here it is right here. It's in the 4th line down. ND 16 or 1/16, optical density of 1.2, which is 4 stops of reduction. So there were 4 stops of exposure reduction on the lens in our baseline exposure. But now we have a problem. We made our exposure 3 times darker. So can we continue to have 4 sets of sunglasses on the lens if the image got 4 stops darker, 3 stops darker?
No, we'd have to take 3 off.
We have to take off 3 pairs of sunglasses, right? Well, if we look at the neutral density chart, you can see 4 stops of reduction is here. 1, 2, 3. Now we're at ND2 or 1/2 or 0.3. Well, the worksheet is using the fraction method. So 4 stops of reduction with a 1/16, and then 3 jumps brighter, which is up the scale, 1, 2, 3. Now we only need ND 1/2 in the camera. You see how this chart works? So 1/2 is what goes in this box for solution 3. 1/2 is like having 1 pair of sunglasses on the camera. You see the f-stop reduction, 1 f-stop, 1 pair of sunglasses, right? So that's the answer to solution 3, 1/2. Let's look at line 4. It's going to start to feel like a pattern, hopefully. Here's line 4, okay? Our new ND filter package is 1/4. Let's look at the chart really quick and see what that is. 1/4 is a 2-stop exposure reduction. So we got 2 pairs of sunglasses on the camera for solution 4. We had 4 pairs on. Now we've only got 2 pairs of sunglasses on the camera. And the frame rate changed and the ISO changed. So everything pretty much changed in this solution, and we need a new resulting f-stop. All right, so let's figure out what the net problem is. 48 frames from 24. What happened to our exposure? The frame rate did what?
Doubled.
It doubled. If the frame rate doubled, that means the amount of light coming through and hitting the sensor did what?
It increases.
It increases, so we go into the right.
If
with,
the frame rate doubles in speed, the amount of light hitting the sensor is going to be reduced by 1/2. Okay, so there's less light hitting the sensor at 48 frames per second. Okay, if you can think about it that way. All right, so 24 and 48, it's twice, it's 1 jump, right? 12 to 24 is 1 jump, 24 to 48 is 1 jump. It's 1 jump darker, so it's 1 stop of underexposure. Okay, if we leave everything else alone, it's 1 stop of underexposure, but some other stuff changed, so we can't stop there. So just remember that this is a -1. Okay, and on your hard copy, you might put a little -1 right here. That would be a good way to help you remember. -1 for this box. 1/48 is the same shutter speed throughout, so that hasn't changed. But 1600 is the new ISO. So the original ISO was 800, now it's 1600. Let's go to the jump chart. 800, now it's 1600. So this represents what?
It's gotten brighter, more sensitive.
By?
-1 cancels out because this is going.
You're right, but you're getting ahead of yourself. So this is 1 stop of overexposure, right? The image got brighter by 1 stop going to a more sensitive ISO. But we had a liability of -1 stop when the frame rate doubled to 48. So yes, they cancel out. This is -1 and this is +1. They cancel out. So you might as well think of this as not having changed. It cancels out. So really all we're doing is a compensation of 2 sets of sunglasses as opposed to 4 sets of sunglasses. Is the image brighter or darker with less ND dialed in?
Brighter?
It's brighter. There's fewer pairs of sunglasses on, right? How much brighter?
By 2 stops?
1/4, 1/16. Here's 1/16. Here's 1/4. 2 jumps, right? Fewer sunglasses and 2 jumps is 2 stops brighter. If the overall image, if the net difference was 2 stops brighter, when we calculate all the change here, it's 2 stops brighter. What do we got to make this aperture if it was originally a 4?
Two.
if we go from a 4 to a 2, are we fixing the problem of being 2 stops too bright?
No.
Which way do we have to go?
Left.
To the left, right? F4, 1 jump, 1 F stop, 2 jumps, 2 F stops. If it's too bright at a 4 by 2 F stops, we can darken the image by 2 stops by going to the left and closing the lens down to an F8. See that? Can you follow me through that whole process? Right? So the frame rate was -1. The ISO was +1. They cancel each other out. The NDs changed. They got brighter from 1/16 to 1/4. The original aperture was a 4, but the problem is the image is too bright with only 2 pairs of ND filters. So I got to close the aperture down to make the image darker. So I go 2 jumps from 4 to 5/6 and 5/6 to 8. That's the second jump on the chart.
I'm sorry, can you explain again why it's 2 jumps?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So the baseline was 1/16, right? We had 4 ND filters stacked on the lens. We had 4 pairs of sunglasses on the lens. But when we changed it to only ND 1/4,
Oh, okay.
there's only now 2 ND filters in front of the lens instead of 4. And each one is a layer, 1 density layer or 1 f-stop reduction. So
Okay.
this is 4 f-stops, this is 2 f-stops. If we took 2 away, we're now 2 stops brighter because
Okay.
there's fewer ND in front of the lens. So 2 stops brighter means the lens has to close down to accommodate that amount of light. Now there's a new amount of light. There's more light coming through the lens. So we have to close it by 2 f-stops or 2 jumps, right? 1, 2. So the answer here for line 4 is F8, right? If this is, if these are all your changes in order to balance this again, so it's the same correct exposure as the baseline, this data has to become F8 from F4. Okay. So that's how this worksheet is supposed to function. So each answer you arrive at should be using the reasoning that I've just showed you. Figure out what your net liability is, what changed and by what rate, what's your new information in the gray shaded box. What does it have to be? The change, what change has to take place? Okay. Always compared to the baseline. So now we know some stuff. So on page 2, we got all our jump charts. And then on page 3, I ask you some questions. So which of the shot solutions will produce grainy or noisy images? Okay. Is this asking for a specific information or is it asking you which shots are grainy and which shots aren't? How do we know which shots are grainy? Well, how do we get grainy images?
The higher the ISO, the more grain is in the image.
So what are you going to do? You're going to go to page 1 on the worksheet and you're going to look for all the solutions that have what?
High ISO.
High ISO, higher than the original, right? If the original was fine, then grainy images are going to result from anything higher than 800 ISO. They could technically start right away with 1600 and it gets grainier and worse as you get higher in ISO, right? So anything higher than 800 technically could produce noisy images, right?
Right.
So
So
your answer would be any one of these with a high ISO. So the answer would be 2, 4, 8. This one changes to, I think ISO, what is it? So 2 plus 2 minus 1, that's a net of +1. So this has to become, yeah, ISO 400, right? So that's not going to be grainy. That's going to be okay. And then 10 is grainy and 11 is grainy. Okay. So all of those numbers would go in the answer box for question 1. So it would be 2, 4, 8, 10, and 11 would be here. 2, 4, 8, 10, 11, right? Which shot solutions make use of 2 or more layers of ND filtration? Well, 2 layers of ND filtration is what? Right here. It's 1/4. So that means anything that is 1/4 or 1/8 or 1/16, that's 2, 3, and 4 layers respectively. So which solutions are doing that? Well, almost all of them, right? Except this one was 1/2. We just did it, right? So it's basically all the solutions except number 3, I believe. And number 10, because number 10, I tell you, there's no ND in front of the lens at all. Okay, so the answer for that one would be something like 3 and 10. Okay. Which shot solutions will produce slow motion videography? Slow motion is a frame rate, right? So what frame rate gives you slow motion?
I think it was either 96 or 98, whatever the ones were offered there.
How about 96 or 48?
Yes. Yep.
1 stop, 2 stops. 1 stop, 2 stops. So how many slow motion solutions are there? Well, number 4, number 5, number 7, number 8, number 11, and number 12. So the answer here is going to be 4, 5, 7, 8, 11, 12, right? For full credit. Which solutions give you fast motion? That's pretty easy. Do we have any?
2 and 9.
2 and 9, 12 frames per second. There's only 2 of them, number 2 and number 9, right? So that goes down here. 2 and 9 in this box. The last question, which shot solutions do not use ND filtration at all? There's only one.
It's just number 10, right?
Just number 10, yeah. I think everything else is asking for ND of some kind, whether it's 1 stop or 4 stops. All of these solutions are using ND except number 10, I believe. Okay, so that's how you answer the questions on page 3. First, you have to do page 1 and then look at all your solutions and then derive the answers for these based on what you put into page 1 in the chart. Okay, which means if you get some answers on the chart wrong, you could conceivably answer a couple of these wrong.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the assignment and we didn't have a 10 or 11 or 12 on it and the one that we were turning in.
Okay, so I took these last 3 off, the one I gave you.
Yes.
Yes.
Cool, makes it easier.
Okay, I just wanted to make
Yes.
sure. Oh my
These are a
God.
little bit harder.
Yeah, I was looking at it. I was like, wait a minute.
Yeah, this is, I used to have a combined cinematography class. So there wasn't a 1 and a 2, there was only cinematography. And so I got a little bit deeper in the weeds on this problem in those classes by changing the shutter angle over here, right? So now you needed to know what this change in shutter angle was going to do to your images. Well, in the new version where I have a cinematography 1 and a cinematography 2, I tell you about shutter angle, but I'm not going to hold it against you. I'm not going to make you work that as part of the problem. So I took these 3 questions out. Okay, and if that's the worksheet you ended up with, then that's going to affect how you answer these down here slightly. Okay, it'll have some difference with number 5 and with number 2. Your answers will be slightly different. Okay, so good. I gave you guys the easier worksheet. That was what was supposed to happen. It's good when a plan comes together.
Now, are we able to redo the worksheet and send it back in with more of this knowledge?
I'm going to grade them first. And then if anybody really bombed it really bad, sometimes what I do is I offer for extra credit a redo on the sheet. In other words, you can go back and fix what you have got wrong. So we'll see. I'm going to take the sheet. I'll use a I'll use a sliding scale or a bell curve, because usually this worksheet is a bloodbath. And I'll grade it all on a sliding scale. And then if it's really bad, I'll offer you guys a way to make up for that. But it might not be. We'll have to see. We'll take a look at how you manage the worksheet. I have had classes in the past where they did really well on this worksheet. I think it all depends on how good of a job I do explaining it, how much reading you did, and how much practice you did before you turned in your worksheet, whether or not you score highly or not. So we'll see what the results are after I get them graded.
Okay, thank you. I just know I was a little confused as to like the different, like if you have the ISO at like 1600 and then the different stops of aperture or ND filter, that was all just going over my head. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, well, it's yeah, and plus we have the benefit of only 6 weeks of class instead of 16. So I spend less time on it in the summer than I do in the fall or the spring, which is a problem inherent to summer classes, is you don't have the time with the concepts that you do in a normal semester. So, maybe it'll come down to offering you a supplementary extra credit shooting assignment or something. I don't want anybody to, in other words, I don't want this worksheet to be the reason why you would pass or fail this class. If your pass or fail is determined by how you did on this worksheet, I'll give you something else that you can make up for it, right? I don't want you to fail because of this worksheet. That would be uncool, right? So let's not worry about it as far as that goes. And let me see how everybody did and get a temperature of how well this concept is sitting with you. And I'll let you know what comes of it. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was a good question. So anybody else have any lingering anxieties about exposure or depth of field or anything?
I have a question.
Yeah.
If going from the frame rate of 24 to 48 was the -1, would going to 12 be +1? Or
Yeah.
Yes? Cool.
Yeah.
So with that +1, I would be moving on like the f-stop 1 to the left?
If you're going +1 and you're looking at the f-stop scale, yeah, +1 is to the right. Because you can see how the apertures are getting bigger when you move to the right.
Mm-hmm.
Each time you move to the right on this scale, you're increasing the amount of light passing through the lens. You're doubling the amount of light, which is an f-stop, which equates to a jump. So each jump is 1 stop brighter as you open the lens. So moving to the right makes you brighter over here.
If the only thing changing, like in number 9, is the frame rate, and like the ISO doesn't change, how would I know which direction for f-stop to go in?
Well, if the only change in aggregate is a frame rate that makes you 1 stop brighter, then logically your f-stop has to change in what way? Does it have to get brighter or darker?
It has to get darker to even it out.
If you're darkening the image on this jump chart, which way do you got to go?
Left. So the frame rate slow or getting faster, like 24 to 12, would always mean that it's getting brighter, or no?
Yeah, if your frame rate is fewer than 24, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
If your frame rate is greater than 24 on the f-stop scale, you got to go to the right. It's the opposite problem. When you increase the frame rate, the image is going to get darker until you open up the aperture. So that's why you're moving to the right if the frame rate is over 24. Make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Good. Is the concept of jumping left and right making sense? Does that help? Okay. Are these charts effective in helping you understand the consequences of jumping left or right?
At least for me, that helped out a lot on doing the assignment. Like, be able to see it visually, like how it works.
It did or didn't help? I mean, you broke up there.
It did help me a lot.
Okay, good, good. The only one I think that's really kind of gives people trouble is the the neutral density chart doesn't quite line up the same way. The changes are up and down instead of side to side, but it kind of works the same way. If you can just turn your thinking like this, and going up is like going to the right and going down is like going to the left, right? If you turn the whole chart on its side, it's still one jump brighter as you go up and one jump is darker as you go down. If you can think about it like that, then the chart kind of works the same way. The only reason is there's a lot more ND. There's a lot more neutral density filtration available than we make use of in film and video. We only use like the top 5 ND filters from this chart in video, and scientific and astronomical instruments and stuff, they can use ND going way down this chart, up to 10 stops of reduction. So, interestingly enough, a 9-stop neutral density filter is, if you look on this chart, it's actually here. If you can translate it, if you dial all of the possible neutral density effect into this filter, which is 9 stops of exposure reduction, look at where it puts you on this chart, way down towards the bottom. That's like saying you added ND 512 to the camera, or 1/512. That's a lot. You'd never see a cut glass filter that's this thick. I don't think we have them, but they do. Cut glass filters in 4x5.65 for Panavision cameras goes down to 2.4 or 1/256, which is 8 stops of reduction. So we're getting there in terms of the technology. This chart, I don't know, this chart has been an effective way to understand ND for probably 10 years now. But the new cameras that are coming out, their sensors are so sensitive to light and their native ISOs are so high that if you go outside, like in Sony FS5, the native ISO that Sony the manufacturer Sony recommends you use for that camera is 3200. So when you go to the beach day exterior with a Sony FS5 and a native ISO of 3200, right away, you're going to need lots of neutral density filters in order to get nicely balanced exposures at the beach day exterior with an FS5, or you're going to be using really, really small apertures and really, really fast shutter speeds. And it's going to be a mess without an ND filter. Right. So the manufacturers used to stop at, ND 9. When I was a young man in the camera department, we only carried 3 ND filters with us in our camera bag, 3, 6, and 9, which was 1 stop, 2 stop, 3 stop reduction. That was it. That's all we needed, because the highest ISO we were dealing with in terms of film stock was only 500. But now when it's 3200, you got to have twice as many ND filters in your bag. So you got to go at least up to ND 1.8, 6 stops, right? Which is, I think that's what the Panavision set had. It had ND 3 through 1.8, which was basically everything in these first few lines, all the way down to 1/64. Okay. So new cameras, new technology is making the ND market a little bit crazy, but this variable filter, though, like I said, this has been a major breakthrough, because that right there is an excellent way now to manage your exposure. It doesn't change your depth of field. So it doesn't change your zone of focus at all. It just makes the image darker overall. Right? So the depth of field, whatever your original f-stop was, is going to dictate how your depth of field is going to perform. Right? So if you use this filter to allow you to use a really wide open f-stop of a 1.4, then all of the soft background detail that you would expect from a 1.4 will still be present in the image, even though you use this filter. All you did was make the world dark enough to where an f-stop of 1.4 made sense to the camera, right? if your original f-stop was an 8 and you dial this in, you're still going to get the depth of field present at f8 without the filter. All you're doing is managing brightness with this filter. That's it. All right, folks. Well, that's pretty much it. So that's the depth of field talk and a review of the worksheet. How do we feel at this point? Are we in a good place, or if there's anybody here and you don't have to single yourself out? Oh yes, who's got the hand up? Who's that? Is that Ariana?
Oh, sorry, I forgot to put it down.
Oh, you're done. So that's not real.
Oh, I'm sorry.
All right. Anybody else though?
Sorry. I was gonna ask about our shooting assignment. You said you wanted some bokeh. Do you want it exactly like those light leaks kind of look, or just a blurry background in general?
Technically there's bokeh in a blurry background, but it's easier to see when you use point sources, because point sources will, you know, when they go out of focus, they'll kind of blob out into those cute little circles. But if you shoot outside and it's just, you know, sometimes leaves in a tree will do it, you know, you'll get little kind of circles out of that when they go out of focus. So pick a subject matter that has a lot of point sources as highlights. Like just go outside at night and shoot a night exterior, like, you know, go downtown or something and, you know, shoot a night exterior of street lights and stuff. And when they go out of focus, they'll go out of focus in nice little ball shapes.
Do we need to create a narrative as well?
Pardon me?
Do we need to create a narrative as well with that?
I don't think so. I think that's just shot management. So, you know, it's not a priority that you have a story attached to that shot.
We just want to show we can do these things technically, correct?
Yeah, I want you to manage the situation. I've got an example in the slideshow. I believe I put one in here. Let's see if I can find it real quick. Oh, I took it out. Let's see, I might have it in here under videos. Let's see here. Oh, I guess I took it out. I used to have a video clip in there that I took of downtown at night, and it showed the out of focus highlights going, you know, out of focus and in focus. Let's see what we got. Let's do this. Let's go to YouTube and let's look for bokeh. Okay, so here's
That was weird.
oh, first we got to hear about Captain America. There we go. Okay, so here's some nice bokeh right here. So these are, I don't know, Christmas lights or street lights or something, and they're nicely out of focus. You know, let's see if he sharpens this up or not. No, I guess it's going to stay out of focus for the whole 3 minutes. Well, that's kind of boring. Let's see what else we got here. Oh, there's some choices over here. 2-hour relaxing music. Screensaver. That's going to stay soft as well. Okay. The choices aren't terrific. I think that's why I shot my own, because there just wasn't enough. Lights in the dark. Same thing. Well, just go for point sources and it'll make it easier for you to really demonstrate it. Just understand that bokeh can be represented in virtually any out of focus background. It's just harder to gauge the quality of the bokeh of the lens itself unless you're looking at point sources. But some lenses, when you shoot with them, you'll see this as you start trying different lenses on different cameras when you shoot your assignments. some lenses have a very nice, pleasing out of focus effect, and some of them look strange, you know, and it has to do with the coatings on the lens itself, and it has to do with the quality of the elements. You know, it has to do with the size of the maximum aperture. For instance, anamorphic lenses don't give you perfect out of focus circles. They give you little sort of oval shapes, right? Certain cinema lenses don't give you perfect circles either. Like, you know, you might get football shaped out of focus bokeh with a Cook lens, and you might get, you know, with a Canon cinema lens, you might get round highlights out of focus. And it just really kind of depends on the way the lens was manufactured, you know. Aspherical lenses versus spherical lenses, anamorphic versus spherical lenses. Different styles of lenses and different manufacturers will give you different qualities of bokeh and the way it presents itself as out of focus backgrounds. And so part of your preferences in lenses as a tool set might be the way the images go softly in and out of focus. You know, you might like the way Cook lenses go out of focus very gradually, or you might prefer, you know, the higher contrast of, you know, an Arri Master Prime or a Zeiss Contax photographic lens. These are the things that will become preferences, and the only way to decide what you like is to test all these different lenses and see what you prefer. So that'll be part of your education moving forward. If cameras and camera issues are your passion and your concern, if you're studying from the point of view of a cinematographer or a cinematographer in training, you expect to do that when you get out of school. These could be the subjects of your research and your personal projects and your assignments, is to explore these things a little bit more deeply, right? I can only touch on them on an introductory course like this one because, you know, I just take for granted that, you know, some of you are not going to pursue a camera career outside of school. So I don't want to burden you with a lot of extra information that you won't use later on. So that's up to you. It'll take a little experimentation. Well, what do you think? Should we adjourn? We can still get out of here a little bit early if we cut the feed now, or I can address questions, or if you prefer, you can reach out to me through email and book a personal Zoom session. We can do that too if you need more time with this.
I just wanted a quick question about the assignment as well. In the depth of field assignment, it's saying we need 3 shots, right? You know, to show depth of field. And the third one being the bokeh one you spoke about. And then there's a 4th clip, I guess, in here as well that's demonstrating a focus throw.
Another focus throw that might be more dramatic this time. So last semester, what happened is I got a lot of people giving me focus throws that had no context to the other shots that they produced, because it was simply mechanical execution of a focus throw from foreground to background. So now I want you to show me how you can use a focus throw as an aspect of compositional choice, right? So show me a clever focus throw that is saying something, that's telling a story somehow. Tie it in with your other shots if you want to. That's really easy. You know, all you got to do is rack focus on, you know, something in the foreground to something in the background and back again in a night exterior, and you'll get bokeh like mad in the shot, and you'll also get a focus throw. You know,
Right.
like I shot cars coming at me down the street in Thornton Park. So I had a nice fountain in the foreground that had, you know, water that was backlit, so it was getting hit by highlights. And as I threw the focus to the cars in the background, the fountain goes nicely out of focus. I wish I don't have my adapter, or I would plug in my hard drive and show you that clip. But you know, so that's the idea. How are you going to get bokeh? There's lots of ways to control depth of field. There's lots of ways of throwing your background out of focus. So what you're going to be showing me now is that you understand all of those different ways of controlling this issue, and you're going to show me something that demonstrates your execution of that understanding. Okay.
Right. Okay. And another question about the assignments. The 3-point lighting assignment, that's further down the road, obviously.
That's next week.
Right. So I don't know, I'm trying to figure out like how I want to shoot these, because if the 3-point lighting is locked until the 2nd, but the email that I received from the equipment room was saying that, okay, we have until like July 30th to do whatever shooting or use that equipment, something
I'm
like that.
pretty sure the 3-point lighting assignment now only involves a software app. And what
Okay.
you're gonna, let me look at it again really quick and see which one I gave you guys, because that's section 2.2, 3-point lighting assignment. Let's see here. What are you turning in? So I'm gonna show you this app next week in class. It works a lot like the depth of field simulator. This is a lighting simulator. It's called Virtual Lighting Studio. You're
Right.
going to create an image in Virtual Lighting Studio using basic 3-point lighting, which I haven't talked to you about yet. And then you're going to create another image where you're going to just go crazy with the app and show me some really wild version of your own style. You know, do you like colored lighting? Do you like moody lighting, darkness? Do you want to use 3 lights or 1? You know, how are you going to do it? And it's in the app. So you're submitting screen captures. Yeah. 2 lighting schemes using the software. So you don't need equipment or anything for this lighting assignment, which is what made it easier to have it for the last week of class, because I'm not asking you to go to school and rent anything. You can do this by saving, you do a screen grab of your work on the application in your computer and submit your screen captures as your work. Okay.
Right. All right. And
I have
You're
a
going to label them.
question.
That's the difference. You're going to do this to your image. So you're going
Right.
to tell me which light source is your key light, which is your rim, which is your fill. Okay. You're going to label it. So that's going to involve taking a screen grab and then probably importing that into something like Photoshop where you can label it, and then saving the labeled version and submitting that as your finished homework assignment. Okay. Yes, Kit.
Yes, I was looking in the Zeus portal for the assignment for the compositional tool, and for the resource group, it still shows assignment 1.6. Will there be like another grouping of equipment for 2.0, or will we just use the same 1.6?
2.0 is depth of field. Yeah, I got to tell them about this assignment really quick. I'll send them another email. They got a form I got to fill out and all this messing about. But yeah, and it'll be basically, you know, checking out a camera again. You don't need any lighting equipment. So it'll be, if you want to check out the FC1000. So I will send that as soon as I get off with you guys. I'll send that request in, so they'll open up another assignment portal for you, and they might give you another passcode. I'm not
Okay, good.
sure.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I'll take care of that as soon as I hang up with you guys. Good question. Good question. This is a new procedure now. I can't just tell you you have an assignment. I have to do all this paperwork for them, like they don't know that you guys are coming or something. I don't understand it, but I'll take care of that. Anything else? No? Should we adjourn the meeting then?
I think Clayton's got something, but he's kind of bugging out.
Clayton, what's up, dude? Did we lose him already? Clayton Edwards. Looks like he might be bailing on us. Okay, so do I have a motion to adjourn?
Yes.
Do I have a second on that motion to adjourn?
Yes.
You can't first and second the motion.
I'll second the motion.
Very good. There we have it. Okay, we have a second on the motion to adjourn. Thanks for your time and attention. I appreciate it.
I wanted to apologize for being
Who's that? Is that Clayton trying to get through? You're breaking up really badly if that's you, Clay. If you,
can you hear me?
oh, there
Can
he
you
is.
hear me?
There he is. What's up?
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, yes. What's up?
Am I in?
Hello?
Maybe. Help. Please, I'm
Hello?
sorry. Hello? Hold on. Wait.
Can't
Can
hear
you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
No. No.
Yes, I can hear you. You must not be able to hear me. That's a bummer. I'll tell you what, if this is the case, if you have a question for me outside of this lecture, just shoot me an email and I will reach out to you in that regard. What I'll do here in the chat is I'll say, email me with further questions. Okay. And we'll leave it at that. And we will adjourn for Monday. And I'll see you guys on Wednesday when we will talk about, sounds like Wednesday, we might start having that conversation about, color theory. We got to do a little bit about that first. So Wednesday, we'll talk about color. Okay. Thanks a lot for coming. I appreciate your time and attention. Have a good afternoon. And
Thank
reach
you.
out if you have anything else to add. All right.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye now.